Well, this has been an interesting day.
Here we are again.
Right? It doesn't seem like this is ending anytime soon.
No. Fool me once, accidental balloon, shame on you. Fool me twice, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So what's the latest? What's the latest, Nick?
Let's see. I know that the DoD seems to have confirmed that there is an unidentified flying object. And just for everybody in the audience that doesn't know what that means, that doesn't mean it's a little green space alien. That just means it's literally what it sounds like, an unidentified flying object. So hang on one second.
We've got breaking for news on here. Breaking for news. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Breaking for news. Can you? Hey, man, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
You've been covering the story earlier. We've been talking on whether we should start a space or not. What's the latest now that convinced you like we've got to start a space urgently? What's the latest that you have?
So this has obviously been a very important 24 hours. We had two separate unidentified objects that have been downed, one off the coast of Alaska Friday afternoon, and one about 3 hours ago in a coordinated effort by the Canadian government and the American military to down a second object over Canada. Now, what we do know about these objects that are different from the balloon project that that's been launched by China, this investigative initiative that they've taken on, is that these objects are, quote, small cylindrical objects. They are at a much lower altitude than the balloons. The balloons travel at about 60 to 65,000 feet. These objects are at 40,000 feet, and that they were down because they presented, quote, a threat to civilian aircraft. Now, additionally, what's going on at this moment is a very complex and fast-moving situation, right? About 2 hours ago, we had the FAA. First, we heard unconfirmed reports that fighter jets, F-15s, had been scrambled from Washington State and from Oregon. We've since confirmed that information, and shortly thereafter, the FAA issued a NOTAM for this restricted airspace over, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Havre, Montana. Now, it's a 50 by 50 nautical mile space, and it has been lifted as of 5 minutes ago. Immediately after, we heard from a representative. His name is Matt Rosendale, and I'm going to read to you his statement. He wrote, "I am in direct contact with the NORCOM and am monitoring the latest issue over Havre and the northern border." Havre is very close to Canada, by the way. "The airspace is closed due to an object that could interfere with commercial air traffic." Now, this is the interesting part. He says the DoD will resume efforts to observe on the and ground the object in the morning. So at this point, they've lifted this urgent NOTAM issue, and they are going to revisit the situation tomorrow morning. So we don't really know what that means, what's going on, why it's not urgent enough to interfere with it right now. But he says it is posing a threat to commercial air traffic. So we don't understand why right now they're pausing this operation.
Yeah, we do know that they are still diverting aircraft that were on approach to Billings International Airport there in Montana. That is still ongoing. We're not exactly sure why, but the fact that the DoD has confirmed the presence of an unidentified flying object should be pretty significant, should it not, Intel?
Intel, you got to
yeah, the story is just being, obviously everyone here raw and breaking. Probably might get the gun on some of it before I do, but yeah, this whole thing's just been weird. The original NOTAM didn't really have the full coordinates, and then they updated the NOTAM with specific coordinates for 100 nautical miles of the center of what that coordinate grid was, and then they just literally pulled it like 5 minutes ago. But they're saying that they're going to resume operations in the morning. That's just weird.
What do we know about
But
that?
they did,
So-
and then the F-15s that were scrambled. I'll check, see if there's any update on that. But I don't think the F-15s have turned around yet. So I'm not really sure what's going on.
Yeah, well, we also know that they sent out KC-135 Stratotankers, and I'm sure you're pretty familiar with those. And we are trying to bring more military folks in here as well that can probably give us a little bit more insight on this. But it does seem that one of those Stratotankers was circling the area where that TFR was actually in place. That national defense airspace was declared by the FAA. So what would that tell you? They're used to typically refuel military aircraft such as fighter jets, correct?
Yeah, and they can also refuel drones as well. It looks like the Stratotanker is leaving the area, going west. So,
yeah. But what would it tell you? Actually, let's go to Breaking 4 first because he seems to have his hand up. Let's get an update from you. Go ahead, Breaking.
I just wanted to make the point really quickly about how we found out about these two objects, right? It wasn't forthcoming from the administration. It was the end of a press briefing that occurred yesterday. And John Kirby was kind of wrapping up his statements, and he got a question from the press. And it was sort of like, is something going on in Alaska?
And let's be clear, John Kirby is the press
secretary
secretary for the Pentagon. So go ahead.
He's no longer the Pentagon press secretary. He's actually moved to the White House as an additional resource. I'm going to find his exact position, but it's been a recent switch. But basically, he then pulled out this pre-written statement and said, yes, now that you're asking me about this, I'll kind of tell you that at 1:45 we kind of just shot down something. So it's a little weird. It's a little suspicious that that's going on, and I'm just going to make that point of how this all unfolded. We don't know if the administration would have been forthcoming if they weren't asked about it. We have no idea. We tried to contact our sources and we didn't get back in time for this space. But an additional piece of information from CNN shows that the pilots of the jets were conflicting. In some of them reported that it interfered with their sensors, these objects. Some of them said that they had no identifiable propulsion of the object and couldn't explain how it was staying in the air. So something is certainly occurring, and we don't know, obviously, if this third situation that has been put on pause over Montana is related, but it definitely seems that all three of these incidences are connected given the time frame. And but they are being clearly separated at this point from all officials, both military and Biden administration, from the Chinese balloon program and the balloon that was shot down last week.
Got it. All right. So okay, Aaron, jump in. I'll let you jump in first, and then I'll go to Intel.
The 50 by 50 mile airspace. What do we know about what's below that? What do we know? Where is that in relation to the nuclear silos around Billings, or where is that in relation to the location of the Chinese balloon?
I'm about to actually post that in the pinned tweet there. But if Breaking knows the information on that, or if Intel knows, then hopefully we can get an answer from them.
Yeah, so in relation to the nuke side of the question, I did make a tweet on that. So the closest nukes would be approximately between 90 and 131 miles west, southwest, and south of the NOTAM. So I mean, it's kind of far, but at the same time, I mean, pretty close. But yeah, the fields, the missile silo fields of Montana, the extreme outer edge of that is between 90 and 131 miles. In terms of what's directly below this town, I'd have to take a few minutes to look around.
Do we know anything about directionality of movement of this object? Presumably it didn't fall from outer space into that 50-mile radius. So 90 to 130 miles doesn't seem terribly far from a critical site if the thing is moving when we intercepted it.
Yeah.
I want to go upward just quickly, Nick. I'll let you come up with tweets and they'll do a bit of work in the background. I'll take over for a bit. Upwards, first time you're on stage. Anything to add before I ask a few questions? Upward news.
Sure, yes. So the Senator John Tester just tweeted, I am aware of the object in Montana airspace and remain in close contact with senior DoD and administration officials. I'm closely monitoring the situation and am receiving regular updates. I'll continue to demand answers for the American public. So it seems like the senator himself isn't exactly sure of what is going on, but it is nice to see that some Montana officials are recognizing the situation and the seriousness of it.
So just to get a good understanding and overview of everything, Rose alerts, breaking for news. You guys, by the way, Upward, appreciate that. And thanks for joining us on stage. Just followed you as well. Joa, you're a regular on stage. That's why I sent you through the invite. If you got any updates at all, please do unmute and add them. Otherwise, just give an overview for the audience. Rose alerts, breaking for news. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because there's just too many flying objects. I'm losing track. So we got the first one that started a few weeks ago that was shot down in the U.S., that was the first balloon that was shot down. Then we had another one shot down in Alaska. It wasn't a balloon, but it was an unidentified object. That was a couple of days ago. And now we have one in Canada that was shot down and another one spotted again in Alaska. Did I get that right? Is there 4 in total? 1 balloon and 3 unidentified objects. Rosalis, you want to take that one?
Yes, I would say that is mostly correct. This current one is currently unknown. It could be a UFO or unknown object, or it could be another Chinese spy balloon. We don't really know yet, but what you said so far is so far correct. So
what do we know about? So what do we know about the? So we know about the first one was a balloon. We know a lot about this. We have videos, we have photos, and that was all over the news. And I think we did a space about it.
yes.
Then we had the second one in Alaska. When was that exactly? Do you remember?
That was a few days ago, and they were reporting the known object was silverish and cylindrical with like a size of a small car. So that was shot down. And then today they just shot another unknown object over Alaska, or not over Alaska, but in the Canada area. So yes, just nuts so far.
Okay, and I want to go quickly to, I've just got Avgi here, and I know breaking for news. You wanted to add anything to what Rosalers mentioned before I go to Avgi, who's, I hope I'm spelling out the name, pronouncing the name correctly, who's an air traffic controller.
Yeah,
go ahead,
let me ask you real quick, Jake, because you were tweeting about earlier that there were F-15s that were possibly scrambled out of Seattle. And then you also mentioned those, as we actually mentioned like a few minutes ago here, about KC-135 Stratotankers that seem to be making their way toward Montana. Do we know where those F-15s went? Could they have possibly gone to that area?
Yeah, so
Jake, that was for Jake, actually.
You mean Rose Alerts, or who exactly? Who's using him?
No, I was trying to go to AV Geek Jake.
Oh, Jake. Oh,
hey,
shit,
yeah,
air traffic
so
controller,
is,
Jake. Hey,
yes.
Jake, how are you, man?
Yes, I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, man. Good. Yeah,
hey,
sorry, not sure if you heard
those,
Nick's question.
Yeah, no, I did. So the question was the F-15s, where were they scrambled out of? So those were out of Portland Air National Guard Base, part of the Oregon Air National Guard, co-located at Portland International Airport. So those came out of there, and they were on a scrambled northbound heading, which typically indicates that, I mean, I don't know if you remember a few years ago when the plane out of Seattle was hijacked. They came out of there. I'm not sure if I'm actually going through right
now. Did we?
You're dropping out. Yeah, I think he's dropping out, Jake. Yeah. So I'll just get the team to DM him and let him know that he dropped out. I wanted to go quickly before you ask a question, Jake. Jake, are you back with us?
Hey, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, he's just muted. Breaking. Yeah, you're back now. I think you're choppy. I think you're on the way. You're in a car or something.
Yes, I am, and that's the wonderful part of the Pacific Northwest, isn't it? So, anyways, those
good.
came out of Portland, and they were in a northbound track scramble, which is basically, I don't know if you guys remember that plane that was hijacked out of Seattle a few years ago. That was the same heading, so we were led to believe that there was something over Seattle, especially since reports on the ground indicated they scrambled with AIM-9 and AIM-120 missiles. And then about 30 minutes after that, we noticed KC-135s out of Fairchild were scrambled, and they were on a southwestbound heading towards the Portland area, and then they turned eastbound towards where this area where the NOTAM and the TFR was over Montana.
Nick, did you have any further questions for Jake?
Nope, I'm doing background
Just
stuff,
bringing up
so
some-
hang tight for give me like 3
I'm
minutes.
bringing. Me too, man. Me too. We got a captain here that's going to be joining us. Let me just send him an invite. Burns, Jet. So all the breaking news guys on stage, feel free to jump in anytime if you've got any updates. By the way, I think this is your first time on stage. Upward News. If there's breaking news, just feel free to jump in. I want to go back. Catherine's with us as well, and I've sent you an invite for Captain Osint. I've sent you through an invite. As a commercial pilot, I'd love your thoughts on the UFOs that we're seeing and why the airspace was closed, in your opinion. So I've just sent you through an invite to come up.
Okay.
I do want to go quickly to Raw's alert and breaking for news, guys. Just to go back the back and forth we're having earlier. Again, Nick, if you got breaking news, just jump in. So we talked about the Chinese balloon. We talked about the UFO in Alaska. Then can you tell us exactly what we saw today? Initially, we saw, and we got Captain here, Captain Osint on stage. I'll give you the mic in a bit, Captain. But I want to go to breaking for news. Question there, man. What we saw now is a UFO was shot down in Canada, and that was by a U.S. jet, and that went over Alaska. And now we're seeing yet another UFO. Am I on the right track? Because I got woken up for this shit.
Yes.
Yeah, you are on the right track.
Jesus.
Sorry, Roz.
No, you're good. Yes, you are correct. So, today, Alaska. Well, not Alaska. Alaska was a couple days ago. Today, NORAD from Canada shot down a UFO. I just call it UFO. And then today we're dealing with this situation. So it's kind of nuts, in my opinion.
Okay, so the one that was shot down in Canada was shot down by the Canadian Air Force, NORAD.
No, it was shot down by the U.S. Air Force.
Yeah, by the U.S. Air Force, F-22, I think.
Yes.
Okay,
Is there
and
a
then
reason why the U.S. shot it?
Sorry, Catherine.
I can answer that question.
I'm just wondering.
The U.S. Air Force, the F-22.
It was NORAD, so it was a U.S. Air Force fighter jet, and F-22, so U.S. patrols as well up there.
Just lifted.
Right. But let me finish that point real quick here. The U.S. Air Force shot down the unidentified flying object because the U.S. and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the U.S. government are the only ones that have F-22s, which are extremely capable fighter jets. They've been used to shoot down every other object in the past week here, and so that would be a good reason that the U.S. would have been the ones to shoot down the flying object with permission from the Canadian government.
So yeah, you're right.
It has to
US
do
is
with the
only-
altitude.
Only government with F-22s active, but the F-22s necessarily didn't need to be scrambled necessarily because they're in Canadian airspace. The reason the U.S. shot it down was because they were the closest ones to it. Canada's closest scramble unit is just north of Vancouver, and this is shot down over the Yukon. So, and those would have been out of Anchorage, Alaska, for the F-22s.
Guys, just quickly, if you
It's
want,
also noteworthy to.
Yeah, jump in. Before you jump in, man, before I go to Captain, anyone that's requesting to speak, please do DM us on why you want to request. There's too many requests coming in. Obviously, we're up to almost 10,000 listeners, so it's hard. It starts to glitch out. Who was just speaking? Was that you breaking for news?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's notable to point out that I think the U.S.-Canada effort and coordination was initiated because this third object that was shot down just a few hours ago over Canadian airspace originally was over Alaska and monitored by the U.S. So it was in coordination along with what people are discussing, which is our military capabilities are significantly more advanced than that of Canada. So we do often train together and do operations together. I also want to point out before we go to the next speaker that Fox News is reporting that this is the first time in U.S. history, this meaning the three incidences of objects and balloons being shot down in U.S. territory, that the aircraft have been used to shoot down objects over North America since Pearl Harbor. So for those who are saying we don't know what this is, this kind of situation, it has been an incredibly significant week militarily of the types of stuff that we're seeing. It's a significant escalation, whatever is causing this. Obviously, we have to at this point still separate the Chinese spy balloon program and the balloon that we took down last week, with these 3 incidences that have occurred, the 2 shoot downs over Alaska and Canada, as well as this potential 3rd object being monitored over Montana.
So we do have a few people from the military coming in. Piotr, I just sent you a DM if you can quickly check it. Austin's on stage. Nick, did you have anything to add and any questions for Captain Osinto I brought up?
Yeah, sure. Captain, I'll ask you a question here real quick. Why would the U.S.
Oh, sorry, just to jump in real quick. Billings Logan International Airport and Havre City in Montana have just reopened and coming the commercial flights. So it seems like they're open now.
Well, the reason for that seems to be, and this is merely speculation at this point, but the fact that the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, has confirmed the fact that there is an unidentified flying object over Montana, and that they're going to, quote, resume operations in the morning when it comes to that, does seem to confirm that they might be allowing this object to take a similar track to the balloon, no?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's a really good question.
Well, we'll bring in Captain
quickly,
here then. Oh, go ahead, Mario.
Yeah. Before Captain, before you go, Captain, to answer this question, breaking for news. If you don't, I forgot your docs. So Mateus, if you can send me through the Fox article or the Fox report that you just mentioned earlier, please, that would be great. If you can just DM it to me on WhatsApp, that would be great. Captain, go ahead. We do have Piotr and Austin on stage as well.
Let me just say real quick, we're going to have a lot of questions here throughout the night, but I want the audience to ask a lot of questions as well. Go hit that purple button there in the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll try to get around a little bit, try to get as many questions as we can from the audience for our expert panel here. So go ahead, Captain.
All right, good evening. Yeah, I'm active current. I'm actually out on the road working right now. Pilot. I won't really talk about who or what I fly, but I do active in the airspace up to flight level 450. Also in the Air Force as a part-timer doing some things. First question, just a housekeeping question. Somebody talked about the F-22 in the United States. It is actually the United States banned the sell and export of the F-22. We are the only country operating F-22s, period, dot, and that will remain that way forever. Unlike the F-35, which is a joint fighter that was sold to some other countries as well. But the F-22 is and will remain a U.S. asset only. Another question that I heard, and it was, why did they choose the F-22 to shoot down this unidentified object? Well, I think it goes with the fact that we've already done it 2 times successful before. They've debriefed these things and they develop tactics in writing. Obviously, those documents will remain classified for a long time. So I think that that's why also the F-22 was chosen as the asset to engage whatever this was. I'm not going to speculate of a UFO or a balloon or whatever, but it was something that they didn't want flying. And so they decided to implement weapons. So that should kind of raise eyebrows in and of itself. So again, I think the reason the F-22 was chosen to shoot down this object in the Yukon was because, hey, we've already done it and we've proven that it can be done. You run a risk of using a new asset that wasn't proven, right? You know, our first time that we engaged that object was over the Atlantic Ocean, whether it be 6 miles offshore, and it worked. We know that the AIM-9X was able to pick up and track these objects. If it was a balloon, whatever it was, it worked. So they were like, hey, we know that this works. Let's do it again because we got to get rid of whatever this was.
So,
tracking, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You finish your point.
Tracking the object over Montana. That really, from my line of work, that's really interesting to me because there's no aviation information posted in a NOTAM or anything for any other aircraft to transit that area. That is a highly saturated route going from East Coast to West Coast and vice versa, especially going into Seattle, New York, and stuff like that. So I'm really surprised that they reopened it. Another thing is I'd be curious to know, how was this object identified? Was it identified by a passing airliner or corporate aircraft? Did somebody lay eyes on it? Because when they scrambled, I do believe there was still some daylight left and they could have put eyes on it. And then also when they dropped this NOTAM, you know, they scrambled the fighters out to the F-15s, which is, again, is a capable platform. It can go up to the higher altitudes. It can't exactly go to the F-22's altitudes, but it's pretty darn close. And if this, especially with this NOTAM being 34,000 feet, that leads me to believe that whatever this was totally within the range of the F-15 and capability. So they reopened that. They dropped this NOTAM, and then they're allowing the aircraft to go in and out of that area. It makes me wonder, okay, did it just up and I'm going to sound crazy here, but did it up and disappear? Did they go out there and find nothing? And something else, guys, we got to keep in mind, we're all human beings. Was this a false ID? Was this somebody saying that they think they see something and called in, and then it got passed up the chain of command to NORAD? Did NORAD make a primary radar target on this object? You know, these are all great questions that we got to get answered.
Captain, would they call this
an
unidentified flying object if they didn't know that an object was there at this point? Because they did say they were going to resume the operation in the morning.
Right, but to answer your question, why was the NOTAM taken down?
I don't know why the NOTAM was taken down. I don't know why we let the balloon go across the United States in the first place. So, you know,
so yeah, and that's a great point. And the thing I'll say about that was that object that they shot down over South Carolina. I mean, that was huge, man. It was the size of a ERJ-170 airliner. I mean, we're talking 3 city school buses. We can't just. I agree, and I know that people will say, "Oh, it could have been shot down over Montana, sparsely populated area." But what if they did shoot it down over Montana and it did hit someone, and then we got all kinds of catastrophe? Also, I think that the reason they shot it down over the water was there was more chance to recover something over the water,
right.
As opposed to it careening into the granite ground at terminal velocity.
Right. All right. So Austin, I know you are very into OSINT. You're very experienced with this. So I do want to ask you as well. What do you think we're looking at here? Do you think that the Department of Defense actually doesn't know what they're looking at? They don't know what they're shooting down?
So in a lot of cases like this, you're primarily picking this up on radar first, and then you're looking for some sort of visual confirmation to get exactly what you're looking at. I actually wanted to comment on the previous sort of thread talking about our coordination with the Canadians, with NORAD. So, I mean, NORAD's been in existence since the Cold War, and we routinely conduct, joint missions for air defense purposes. In regards to, I completely agree with Captain on the choice of the F-22 for this mission, and just because, with similar missions being done successfully, it makes sense. But I think also a larger point here is just really simple logistics. If you look at the disposition of CFB Canadian Force bases and where their interceptor aircraft are based out of, this interception was conducted in the Yukon, and the closest Canadian Forces base to that would be in Cold Lake, down in I believe it's Alberta or Manitoba. Whereas the U.S. Air Force operates multiple bases out of Alaska that are just closer, they're easier to get to. It makes sense that, this was a joint op, and it also just makes sense for expediency that the U.S. Air Force was the one to do it over the Canadians.
Okay, and so, Catherine, I know that you.
Before, Nick, just to give you a quick update before we go to Catherine. Also, we've got Piotr here and Adam as well. I brought up Adam for you. We do have, just for anyone listening, Jake, who is the air traffic controller. He'll be coming back up because he's driving at the moment. In a few minutes, we'll be bringing him back up. We do have a few military officials as well, that we're chatting to and ex-military officials that will be coming up shortly as well. Nick, just thought I'd update you in the meantime. But go ahead, man.
Awesome, Catherine. I just want to bring you in here real quick because Austin did mention how. The Canadian government was involved with this and talking about why the U.S. would actually come in and do this rather than the Canadian government. That's been a huge question that I have gotten because I've been keeping updates on my Twitter all day long on this. That's probably one of the most popular questions. Why would or did the Canadian government, did Justin Trudeau ask for this to be done in Canadian airspace?
Yes, he did.
For Catherine.
Yeah,
he did, though, Nick. It's a pointless question. Yes, he did.
Okay, well, I'm sure she's got more to say, Piotr. So let's let Catherine go. Go ahead, Piotr. Or go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, well, sure. I mean, sure. Piotr, I guess, is correct. He did. But I mean, the cooperation between the U.S. and Canada is strong. But what I did find sort of interesting, and I guess that was part of my question to some of the people that we have on stage who have some expertise in this, is that it didn't take long for this to happen, right? So compared to what it seemed like a much more decisive action compared to what was going on with the sort of the balloon in the U.S. So I find that kind of curious that this happened as soon as it sort of reached Canada. It was a very quick, decisive action. And also, the balloon is being labeled as a balloon, whereas this is being labeled a UFO. So is it because they don't know what it is, or they don't want to announce what it is? So I find that those are kind of interesting questions. Is it because the U.S. sort of already learned what actions they want to take, in the first get-go, and they've already decided with the Canadian counterparts what they would do in that situation? What are your thoughts, Captain Ozent, I guess? Or Nick, if you think there's a more appropriate person on the stage to ask him.
Let's let Piotr jump in first. Piotr?
Well, look, I mean, the Canadians have a joint agreement with the U.S. Air Force to defend their airspace. So it's not surprising at all that the Canadian government have asked the Americans to come in on this matter. Moreover, this has happened already 3 times in the past week. So it's more than likely Biden's Defense Department and the Canadians have already been in touch about these things. So the fanfare around the questions as to why the Americans got involved is unnecessary. It's creating unnecessary fandom when there isn't really anything to be that surprised about. I am more concerned by the lack of public communication about what this thing is. I thought the other event yesterday, or whenever it was, Friday morning, was a balloon. But then after reading some of the reports about its size, description, and the fact that at the altitude by which it was shot down at 40,000 feet, this is beyond the size of conventional weather balloons, at least as we know them, to be able to float up, at least at the size of a car. So this is quite clearly another, I don't know, object, thing, entity, what it is. Now, just for FYI, for the audience, I still think that this is most likely related to the Chinese. I don't see why the Russians would be doing this. The Iranians don't have capabilities. Why would the Japanese or the South Koreans be doing this? So it really only speaks, and the North Koreans, I'm not aware of anything. They have the capacity for this. So for me, it's really only a Chinese thing of origin. The Americans would not be doing this in some kind of weird.
Piotr, quick question, Piotr, hold on, Nick. Piotr, before I go to all sources, has been with us, and Adam as well. I've got a question for you because you've been covering the China-US tensions for a while. You're an expert in the field. How major is this? And Fox, I did want to tweet something. By the way, anyone listening, Breaking 4 News sent me through an image of apparent image of the UFO. I've just tweeted it on my profile if you want to see it. It's nothing too exciting.
I
Sorry?
think you posted a picture of the UFO that they, well, let's not call it a UFO. Let's call it an unidentified aerial object or whatever.
Yeah, but it's nothing special. Just for a heads up. It's a pretty shitty photo.
Like
actually, I'll delete
it and wait for a better
photo.
That photo just went out about 10 minutes ago, purportedly being someone's brother capturing the photo. Additional resources like CNN and Reuters are reaching out to confirm the photo's location and authenticity. And once that's done, we'll give some more information about what it is. But it shows 2 white lights in the sky. It's not very clear at all what's going on at this point.
Planets or stars a little bit, but I could be wrong.
I say that again, man.
It looks like planets or stars a little bit,
like
but
Mars
I could be wrong. It could, yeah.
So we're gonna work on confirming that here, but
yeah, I do want to go quickly if you don't mind, Nick. Also, you've been with us as well since the early days. So after Piotr answers the question, I do want to go to you as well. So Piotr,
Mario, do you mind if I finish my point?
It's the question I have for you, Piotr, is how serious is this? Now I do want to refer to a quote that Fox News and I think also Breaking 4 News or Rosalo sent me this. Fox quotes the following, and I'm going to read it out. This is the first time in U.S. history that aircrafts have been shot down over North America since Pearl Harbor. So we'd love to get your thoughts on this, Piotr.
Well, we have no confirmation. Okay, number one, Fox is an entertainment news source, not a verified news network. Fun fact. So they're going to be slightly sensationalist when they portray the information. Second, this is no confirmation that this is an aircraft. It's just a orbiting object. Therefore, we don't necessarily mean if this was an actual aircraft, so a Chinese aerial thing that was going up against an F-22 Raptor or whatever it was that shot it down, that's a significant cause for concern. I don't have significant cause for concern because the Americans have decided that we're going to let this thing bob around over US airspace overnight. So what I encourage everybody to do is follow this but keep it in a sense of perspective. What happened last week was that half the fandom that came around this thing was the media itself building up this hysteria and stuff, because we are very well aware of the concerns between China and Russia, China and America. Tensions are high, but this does not mean suddenly that the Chinese are going to be launching aerial invasions into American airspace with paratroopers coming down over Montana.
Well, okay. Well,
this
is all speculation here. This is all speculation.
And so I think we need to just keep a sense of
okay,
respect.
I'm going to go ahead and go to All Source here, because All Source, I do want to ask you, why are the Chinese, or why is the U.S. government not placing blame on the Chinese at this point? We haven't gotten that for since the first balloon that flew over, right?
And by the way, Nick, just FYI, I did bring up Igor, who's been on the producer behind Ukraine on Fire, who's been on the show before. So just give you a heads up that I've just brought him up as well. Okay. Go ahead, also.
Yeah. So look, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is, and I'm going to bring up 2 points. One about your question, Nick, right now, and then the second one about the U.S. Canadian, right? Why did the U.S. do that? So one, look. The term, and I think to Ian's point, right? What do we call this? UFOs, like the term the DoD utilizes is unknown, unmanned, or I think it's unknown aerial phenomenon, UAPs, right? But for everybody else, it's UFOs. Like those have been occurring for a very long time. I think what happened is because of the Chinese spy balloon, there has been a decision, a lesson learned within the Defense Department and this administration, which would probably carry on, that now from now on, any UAP that violates U.S. airspace will be shot down. Period. Done, because of the public pushback of what happened with the Chinese spy balloon. That now I think this is a new standard that they're going to apply and saying we are going to defend our airspace and our territorial integrity. But UAPs are not new, and sightings of UAPs within even the Defense Department are nothing new. It's the response, and more importantly, I think the public statement that we have from U.S. and Canadian officials publicly stating this, because again, the one in Alaska and Canada, we wouldn't have known about unless it was because of U.S. government and Canadian government.
And also, I'll read this out to support what you said. Montana, someone just sent me this from the team. Montana is home to some of the most significant, well-documented, and interesting UFO reports in the history of ufology.
Yeah, so I think that's something new. Like, I think in the past, anything that was a UFO, UAP, we were just kind of hush, don't talk about it. And now the administration said, yep, we're going to be publicly saying. And I think why they're not placing blame is because they just don't know. And I think they don't want to cause a diplomatic incident without having further information of what's going on. This can be a million of things. I mean, I think there's also notions like, this could have been just a commercial entity, and this thing has just floated around and nobody really knows. And the NORAD detected it's like, all right, we're going to shoot it down, right? And maybe there's going to be new regulations to control it, right? One of the explosions we've seen in the last 10 years and 5 years really is just the commercialization of drones and how a lot of private citizens are also going into space. I mean, we've all seen the YouTube videos of just normal citizens that 10, 20, 30 years ago would have been absolutely insane and just become more and more and more prevalent. So again, I think that's why we just have to step back. Now, Nick, to your question about the U.S. Canadian, right? So what's very important, and I think Austin hit this, right? So the commander of NORAD is dual-hatted as also the commander of U.S. NORTHCOM, right? U.S. Northern Command is also the commander of NORAD. NORAD, as everybody knows, is a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Canada saying we are here committed to defend each other's airspace no matter what, right? What I think people need to understand and recognize is that U.S. military relations with what the term is we use is called the Five Eye partners. Five Eyes, that is U.S., Canada, U.K., Australia, and New Zealand. Even from a military standpoint, that's just talking about intelligence, but from a military standpoint, we are very integrated, right? And it's very common for U.S. military officials, especially in commands and in command headquarters, to have as their superior officer a British, a Canadian, Australian, or New Zealand military officer that serves in your immediate chain of command, right? There is a deep level of integration between U.S. and Canadian, U.S., U.K., and all those Five Eye partners, very integrated, right? And if you talk about NORAD, we have 50 plus years of integration in the defense of airspace. I believe the deputy commander of NORAD, right, the second in command, I believe is always a Canadian, right? The first is a U.S., and then the second is a Canadian officer, right? So people need to acknowledge that in many incidents in military terms, when we're talking about Canada, the UK, and U.S., Australia, New Zealand, there's such a deep integration that, and it's only going to get more and more and more integrated, right? That is in many ways that we all operate very similar, even more so than the term I think we all use to NATO. So I think that is why the Canadians, and I think Austin brought up a good point, hey, the F-22s out of Alaska were closer, they're going to intercept it. If there's a threat to the U.S. and it goes into Canadian airspace first, the Canadians are going to shoot it down because in NORAD we share a lot of information with the Canadian U.S. That is just it's a single command with both militaries, and our Defense Department and their Ministry of Defense just talked extensively together.
Okay, so let me ask Adam a question real quick. And all source, I'm going to bring you back in about 15 times here in the next half hour. But Adam, I want.
Oh, Nick, I told Mario I'm going to be
Yeah, all good. I'll DM him. I'll DM him. All good, bro.
I'm at a birthday
all
party,
good. All
but
good.
I'll be jumping in and out.
Perfect. All good, man. I'll let him know. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. Adam, I want to know a little bit about, because you are you're a Marine Corps veteran, and you have worked for various government agencies as well. Why do you think the U.S. is being so quiet about these aircrafts, these unidentified aircrafts? Do we not really know what's going on here? Why are we not blaming the Chinese?
Well, hold on, the microphone's not working. There it is. To the point of somebody brought up earlier, is that you don't want to force a diplomatic incident when you don't need to have one, right? You know, these it's not like these like the balloon, for example, that we were tracking for those several days that was shot down outside of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, was having markings that said, this is a property of the Chinese government. It wasn't where it didn't have markings necessarily on it. So, like, when you start seeing these, especially if these are spy balloons, they're not going to be announced of whose possession they belong to, what are they doing, and so it requires investigation. But I really want to point to something else that was brought up earlier, which was the frequency of these things being detected now. And I'm going to throw up in the Jumbotron real quick, but Alex Horton with Washington Post actually brought up, wrote something about this today, about how it's believed that NORAD has changed their methodology when it comes to detecting objects in the air, where they've actually basically are going after anything that's the size of a Volkswagen, basically. And so that's really kind of a change in things. So, when you're looking at observing the airspace or observing anything using electronic means, right, you have various criteria that help filter the noise. And so, one of the things that was heavily discussed with the first balloon that we saw was the fact that it wasn't really detected, or supposedly wasn't detected, until it reached continental U.S. airspace. Well, that might have been a function of the people actually observing, assigned to observe this, actually actively filtering out objects at that elevation of that size, etc. So, I think that there's a huge defense posture change, to another person's point earlier.
Yeah. Igor, I'll welcome you back real quick, and then I definitely want to go to Austin. But Igor, what are your thoughts on the situation? And I'm sure I'll have some follow-ups for you.
Yeah, first of all, that we have an ongoing active military action in Europe, and that balloon situation, I believe, triggered our level of attentions from unidentified objects flying in United States airspace, and after that, change in the posture, plus the media and agreed of some kind of sensationalism, and that's altogether producing this kind of effect. This is my vision on this. Nothing more, nothing else. I just want to point one thing. During Caribbean missile crisis, that was spotting a lot of UFO flying over our fields with ICBM. So we cannot rule this out.
I do want to add one thing to what Igor said. So Joa Santos, who was on stage earlier, who's a regular on the stage, he sent me an NPR.org article, and there's an increasing number of UFOs throughout 2022. So I haven't read the article, but this is the heading by NPR. The Pentagon got hundreds of new reports of UFOs in 2022. The government report says, which is well above average.
Mario,
so just wanted to mention that.
Look completely understandable. If somebody watching us, and if that entities have higher conscience than ours, so they will be very worried now, because we inch into the thermonuclear World War III. That is why. If that's really UFO trying to intervene, so we're in a good hands. But I believe in media. I believe media explanation.
Sorry,
Thanks, Igor. Go ahead, Rosalet. Yeah, go ahead, Rosalet.
From Bino News, Fighter just investigated a radar anomaly over North Montana, but nothing was found, NORAD says.
Well, so that's an interesting development based on.
Hold on. Breaking for news. You want to add on that development because I know you were trying to speak as well.
No, that's basically what we're learning at this point was that given the heightened sensitivity surrounding these two objects being shot down, this appears to have been a false alarm, that NORAD detected a radar anomaly, sent fighter aircraft to investigate, did not identify any object, and will continue to monitor the situation, which does line up with what the earlier congressmen and senators were saying, that the investigation will continue tomorrow morning during daylight, but clearly doesn't pose a significant enough threat to act right now, and that nothing specific was found, right? So it's a big announcement and just shows how highly sensitive we are at this point, given the situation that occurred last week with the balloon program, as well as the two incidences off our western coast.
Okay, well, let me go to all source on this real quick then, because it does seem like the the Department of Defense was referring to this as an unidentified flying object. What is their definition of UFO? Does it mean that, they think they saw something on the radar, there might be something there? Or are we looking at, because it almost seems like at this point there were two conflicting statements, no? All source,
you there? I think you told me to DM him when he needs to speak.
Okay, gotcha.
Let me DM him now.
All right, well, I'll give it to either
Justin.
Captain or...
Go to Justin and Captain, bro.
Yeah,
Justin and Captain, jump in, guys.
Austin or Captain, I guess.
Well, this goes back to what I was saying is when they pulled the NOTAM down and they essentially let that airspace go. I thought that was a little odd. I'm actually watching Flight Radar 24, and there's actually a WestJet 722. It's a 737 at 35,000 feet. I mean, it's going straight through the area in which they had blocked off or restricted. So I think what we're seeing now is that hypersensitive nature of the DoD, and just want to make sure that they want to basically they don't want to let it happen again. And so I wouldn't say we're knee jerking, but I would say that they're definitely on a hypersensitive alert.
But why at this point would they come through and say that we're gonna start investigating again in the morning? Clearly, they're not very sure on what they're telling us, right?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I saw a tweet momentarily ago that radar anomaly was picked up by a weather radar in that area. Something was reflecting back. I'm not a specialist at radar returns and signals, but there was something to be said with that, and I saw that tweet about it. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah,
we're trying to go ahead, Rosalind.
Yeah, so I was looking at my radar drop. It's a CC drop. They use it for tornadoes, for debris signatures, and I'll probably post about it on my page shortly, or if you can find a post. So there was a giant line of unknown debris going across, so I would think the radar picked up that. So I don't know.
What are the odds that it reached, like that it was discovered actually before it reached Canada, but they've decided to shoot it down in Canada due to various reasons, including maybe, positioning. And also, I think we seem to, think that it is Chinese, but is it because we're so diligent now and we know that the previous ones came from China? Could it be something else?
Well, just to be clear, Catherine is referring to the object that was shot down over Canada today, not the object that we're talking about in Montana. So,
sorry, yes, the object in Canada. Yeah, as a Canadian, I'm more hyper focused.
Of course,
at the moment.
Sure. Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and toss that to Adam real quick.
Yeah. So why I was going to ask for clarification on the question. Are you asking why they chose to shoot it down over Canada, or?
Well, I'm wondering, because it makes it sound like the reporting makes it sound as if the object was discovered when it was in Canada, but could it have been flying over the U.S.? They discovered it over the U.S. and shot it down in Canada?
Catherine, they have confirmed that it did overfly Alaska yesterday, and it was actually identified in U.S. airspace yesterday, even though that we shot down another one of these objects in Alaska
I
yesterday.
brought in, and by the way, Nick, I just brought in Jake again, who could probably give us more context on this. He's got a good connection now.
I can't see him, but
yeah, I've just sent him an invite. He just DM'd us. He's ready to come back up. Austin, go ahead, man. And Austin, like,
okay, well,
so
we
go
just
ahead,
got something from the
Nick.
Canadian Defense Minister. It seems that the object shot down over Canadian territory posed reasonable threat to civilian aviation. It's a similar thing that we heard about the one that was shot down in Alaska yesterday. So it gives us hopefully a little bit more context that this object may have been a lot more. It may have been very similar.
Jake, Jake is on stage as well. Nick, I know you had some questions for him.
Sure. Jake. All right. So I don't know if you just heard that. I don't know. Did you listen to the press conference with the Canadian Defense Minister by chance?
No, I didn't get a chance to for that press conference.
All right. Well, it does seem that she has not confirmed the altitude that this object was flying at. Obviously, we know the one yesterday was shot down in Alaska was 40,000 feet. This one was allowed to overfly Alaska for some reason, but it does seem that the description that the DoD gave about the object in Alaska that they shot down is the same, very similar to this one that we just found in Canada today and shot down. So what are we looking at here?
And then and Nick, they're not similar. This question goes to you and breaking and Mateus. This is not similar to the balloon, is it? The description that we have so far.
No, it's not the same.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I did watch portions of the Canadian Defense speech, and she did confirm that this second object that was downed this afternoon was in fact traveling at around 40,000 feet. The U.S. was more specific, saying 40,000 feet. Canada said around 40,000 feet. That's one. So that we can confirm that information and those similarities, as well as the description of the object itself being almost identical to what was downed off the coast of Alaska on Friday afternoon. Mario, remind me of the second part of your question that you were asking.
No, I was just comparing them to the balloon the balloon that was initially spotted in the U.S. The UFOs that were shot down in Alaska, now in Canada, they don't fit that description, do they?
They certainly don't. I mean, size-wise, these are being compared to the size of a small car. We understand that just the payload of the balloon that was downed was the size of approximately 3 buses. And then the balloon itself was much larger.
So what do you think? The question to you and others, like from what we know about these UFOs, because UFO sightings are relatively common, for them to be shot down now and that sense of urgency that we have, is that the US or US and Canada just being too sensitive after the Chinese balloons, or is it, because we just don't know what they are, we don't have any clarity, or is there something we don't know?
Mario,
I know you did a space earlier on this.
Yeah, Mario, why is the Biden administration that promised to be the most transparent administration the United States government's ever had not coming out telling the American people exactly what it is? Why can't we have a president that tells us what it is? Exactly.
It's because
Austin, you were jumping in?
Because the DoD is actively working to assess what it is. That's the reason why.
You don't think they know what it is? They went up there. They went up there and shot something down. They didn't know what it was.
Yeah. So the reason
I do want to
nobody does that. That's reckless.
Actually, no. I actually want to pose a question to Captain and Jake here, and I think at least from where I'm looking at it, the reason that we saw quicker shoot downs of these other two objects, based upon these most recent statements, actually has a lot to do with altitude, as well as sort of precedent being set last week, right? So the large scale Chinese balloon we saw overfly the country was at around the altitudes that were being reported of 60,000 to 65,000 feet. That's far above what you would typically see a commercial airliner cruise at. Commercial airliners, to my understanding, typically cruise anywhere from 33,000 to 44,000 feet. And both of these incidents, the one over Alaska and the one over the Yukon in Canada, were at those altitudes. So those, to my understanding, would pose a more sort of exigent threat to commercial air traffic.
Yeah, the 60,000 foot ones are definitely not a threat to civilian aviation. The highest flying aircrafts, as far as civilian aviation go, are your Gulfstream G650s and Global expresses, which typically have about 51,000, 53,000 feet at the max, and that's a very rare occurrence. But they are certified to go up there. On average, you're talking from about 45 down to about 35 is the high saturated areas of air traffic. So, but I think Mr. Cardone is correct in that, you don't just shoot something you don't know what it is, right? Like you wouldn't pull a gun out and shoot a bush that's moving, right? It comes down to the same thing. So I think we know what it is, but maybe due to the and I'm just gonna kind of back up the DoD on this and say that due to the remoteness of both of where these things were brought down, is communication might be a little limited.
we do have breaking news here from Breaking 4. If you want to jump in and kind of give us it does look like there are a lot of the government is even it's contradicting themselves. If you want to come in, Breaking 4, this is kind of big.
Yeah, basically what we're seeing right now is conflicting reports from the members of Congress, the lawmakers in Montana, and they're reporting based on the briefings they received from officials versus what we're hearing right now, which is that this was a false alarm and the jets were dispatched as a precaution and discovered no such object to be seen. So someone quoted that Fox News just hosted one of the congressmen that we're discussing, and he confirmed that there was in fact this object that he was being reported on, and now we don't know why they've retracted that statement and put out a clarification saying that it was in fact a false alarm. So these stories move quickly.
So Breaking 4 news, hold on.
Mario,
Matthias, quick question, just try to get an understanding. Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
I'd like to ask the captain, how many times have you flown commercial above 41,000 feet?
Well, before we do that, I want to clarify this thing real quick. I'm going to read the exact comment here that a congressman just confirmed on Fox News that he was briefed that an object was confirmed to be over Montana, and that the reason for reopening the airspace is because they cannot effectively take it down in the dark. And these reports are conflicting, or some are speculating that it could be, a little bit of a cover up. But we're going to work in the back.
Hold on, so essentially, a congressman just confirmed on Fox that there was a UFO sighting in Montana.
Yeah.
But the reason that they open up the airspace is they just can't shoot it down
in the dark.
Yeah, in the dark. Yeah, they can probably take it in the morning. I'd like to go to Alex here. He says that he's got some information on this. Can we go to him?
Captain, your mic is...
Captain, yeah.
Yeah, let's go to Alex.
Yeah,
here.
Alex.
Yeah, I'd like to go to him because he's got information.
Well, I don't have anything like breaking on this subject, but I do just want to kind of provide a little bit of historical context to this. We're obviously dealing with a couple of different things here. Of course, there's the Chinese balloon that flew over the mainland United States and was shot down off the coast of North Carolina. And then we have the incident on Friday where we shot down something over Alaska. Now we may or may not have something over Montana. But specifically with the incident over Alaska yesterday, and also potentially with the incident tonight over Montana, there is some historical precedence with this. And I know it's kind of laughed at, UFOs, haha. But I did quite a bit of reporting on UFOs. And this is somewhat reminiscent of something called the 2004 Nimitz incident, which was an encounter of something that was described to be very much like the object encountered over Alaska. This was encountered in 2004 off the coast of California by a carrier group, a couple of different fighter squadrons. And the object that was engaged in that encounter sounds a lot like the one that we saw over Alaska, car-sized, metallic. We don't know what's holding it up in the air. We don't know what means of propulsion it has. And so when people talk about UFOs, comparisons to the Nimitz incident, which is so famous in those communities, gets people really excited. And so I worry that maybe some of that excitement about that is starting to bleed over into these other instances where, a lot of this seems to be happening very quickly, very very rapidly in conjunction with the Chinese balloon incident last week. So I don't want to be jumping to conclusions here, saying that there is, UFOs, there's more balloons, say what one thing is definitively or not. I just worry that people are going to hear UFO and be like, oh my God, we got an alien invasion coming here, when that's just certainly not the case.
I do want to go, Grant. I know you're trying to speak earlier, then I'll go to All Source afterwards.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Grant.
So I've owned some aircraft, and we have one that flies at 51 to 52,000. Most commercials flying at 41, and most of the time it never hits there. I was asking the captain, how many times have you been above 41,000 feet on any of the Boeings or Airbuses?
Captain, is your connection better now? Yeah, it is.
I got my earpods in, so my microphone should be better. I don't.
Yeah, it's much better now. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't hear him.
I think he's dropping out. Yeah. I'll
And then,
go to Also Swallow. Oh, sorry, I just muted everyone. Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, and then for the room, I mean, if you guys are talking about alien, like alien UFOs or military UFOs, my point about the 41,000 is most of this military equipment is flying at 40,000, 38,000, 39,000 feet. Like, this would be. There's no way in the world that the U.S. military is going to start shooting shit out of the sky that it doesn't know what it is. It's not even real. They're going to know before they attack something.
And can I get more clarity from anybody? Maybe also, I don't know if you can answer that one, but not being able to shoot out the unidentified object in the dark, how common is this? Maybe, Alec, we can go back to you, as you got a lot of experience with UFOs. Can you give any context on what that could mean? And if anyone else can, from the audience or from the panel, please, audience, do DM me or put in the comments if you do have any experience and you can give more clarity on this. What does it mean exactly that you can't shoot it down in the dark?
So I think that the issue was that they couldn't provide a positive ID, the issue over Montana, and that's why they decided to do this weight approach. And specifically, maybe there was concern more because the Montana is there's more civilian population, and the concerns of that they can't do proper analysis of where the debris field would be. But I mean, the U.S. Air Force can't shoot down things at night; they have clear capabilities. But there might have been something that when they saw a closer observe, that maybe they noticed it wasn't necessarily a huge threat, and they wanted to wait until the morning to get more identification to really figure this out. But again, I think I'm going to go back to my previous comment in the beginning, right? And I think this is when I first spoke is the Chinese spy balloon incident, I think, caused a change, right? I think there has been a deliberate attempt by the administration, because of criticism that was leveled for it for allowing the spy balloon to go through, that they changed the rules of engagement. And I think the issue is, if this is an aircraft that is something is flying over U.S. or Canadian territory, that should not be there. That it is not either civilian or allowed to fly up there through FAA or whatever the Canadian equivalent is, we're going to shoot it down. And I think that is because of the criticism of the Chinese balloon, and this is a new rule of engagement, and this might be a more recurring issue.
Yeah. But guys, if they're going to wait until morning to shoot it down, that means it's another balloon, not a jet, because no aircraft has 8 or 9 hours of fuel capacity.
Let me ask you, All Source, on that topic. How often would you say that the U.S. government, because their initial claim here was it was a UFO, and then they said it was a radar issue, and now you have U.S. congressmen coming out and saying that it's not a radar issue, it's an actual UFO. How frequent would it be for them to just have some sort of anomaly where they have a false alarm on a UFO, like they claimed about an hour ago?
I can actually speak to that a little bit, and it's not like crazy common, but we do know with when you say UFO, of course, that's just military parlance, or for anything that's unidentified in airspace. It can be absolutely anything. It can be your neighbor's homemade hot air balloon. But the thing that our military members are sometimes seeing that are called UFOs, or sometimes UAP, that are actual craft that we can't seem to match in combat. These things, they're not easily engaged because they seem to have some kind of radar defeat.
I do have some jump in on that point for radar.
Yeah, go ahead, Jake.
So I'm an air traffic controller, and we use radar pretty often, obviously. And as far as like getting blips on the radar that you don't know what it is, happens countless times a day. What do you mean countless? At least 50 times, or we literally lose count. Now we're dealing with blips that are a lot lower. So it could be a flock of birds or even a drone, or like one of the other members said, potentially like just your neighbor's balloon or something like that. But it's the same type of technology when you're looking at like 60,000 feet, 40,000 feet. The only difference is there's not a whole lot that's going to be up there other than something that's deliberately placed like a Chinese balloon or something like that. But yeah, as far as they don't know what it is, that would kind of make sense as far as at night not being able to get a proper ID on it and just seeing a small blip on the radar.
Okay, let me say this real quick. It says that the United States says that the object shot down over northeastern Alaska yesterday is the size of a car. We knew that part, but it did not have the ability to maneuver, and we do not know what the origin of the craft was. And earlier today, CNN actually reported that pilots that were assigned to take care of the aircraft or the unknown object in the air were saying that they were so confused on the propulsion system of the aircraft. So why are we still looking at this as, we just have no idea where it came from? Or do we not have the ability to track these things, days ahead?
Exactly. Of course.
Alex?
And I'm trying to see if my micro's doing a little bit better now with the Wi-Fi.
It is now, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Captain.
Okay. I saw a report that said that the debris field, or the debris from the one shot down in northern Alaska, was, quote, they found a bunch of, quote, tiny pieces, as if it like shredded itself. Now, the difference is that AIM-9X probably hit the actual object, unlike it where it hit the balloon off of South Carolina. So take that with a grain of salt. If it was broken into 1,000 pieces, AIM-9Xs really don't break stuff into tiny little pieces. It's just made to punch big holes in the stuff. So, take that for what it's worth, and, add that to your analysis of what this could be.
I'm bringing someone that worked at NORAD now, Nick, so I'll go to you as soon as he comes up so you can ask him the same questions. But just to confirm for anyone listening, because I do get people DMing me, can you reconfirm, Nick, that we are getting conflicting reports on one side of the one side of the report that it's just a sensor blip in terms of the craft over Montana, but then we've got the congressman who reported that there was an unidentified object over Montana. They just couldn't shoot it down in the dark, and the operation will continue tomorrow morning. Is that correct?
So it does seem like originally the Department of Defense had come out and acknowledged the presence of an unidentified flying object. They later came back and said it was just a radar blip issue, but a congressman who, obviously congressmen do have a lot more information when it comes to intelligence and classified information. And that Montana congressman eventually came out and said, yes, there was an actual object in the sky, but they're not going to shoot it down in the dark. So that's this is going to be this is a situation that's going to have a lot of developments tonight.
Mateus, anything else to add to this?
Yeah, I'm just getting a link to a Wall Street Journal report. This is on the situation that unfolded over Canada this afternoon. The Wall Street Journal, quoting sources familiar with the situation, is reporting that the object that they shot down, quote, appeared, sorry, I just lost the quote, 1 second, quote, appeared to be a small metallic balloon with a tethered payload. That's being reported by the Wall Street Journal moments ago, and quoting U.S. sources familiar with the situation. I'll link this up in the nest for those who want to see, and I'll also share it with you, Nick, and with you, Mario.
Do we know what the payload is?
I also
have they
information
said
that we're
anything
getting.
about the payload itself, or is it just a payload, quote unquote?
The exact quote just mentions a payload. It does not go into specific detail, but we obviously do know the size of this, quote, metallic balloon with a tethered payload is around the size of a small car, as reported by U.S. sources.
Okay, let me jump in here real quick. ALX just sent this to me, so shout out to him. I pinned it in the top. Representative Rosendale, the congressman from Montana, says that the Department of Defense called him and said that they will be, quote, tracking the object detected above Montana, quote, until it gets light again, and says, quote, they cannot bring it down in the dark. So that was the exact quote from Fox News that was reported on earlier.
And I just brought up Emergent Perspective. Are you there?
Hey, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, man. Can you tell us a bit about your background, and I would love your thoughts on the situation.
Okay, all right. Let me start with the background. So, in another life, it's been about actually since I left defense contracts, been about 8 years. But prior to that, I was U.S. Army Air Defense Artillery. I worked on networked air defense systems. We monitored and protected the airspace 30 nautical miles around Washington D.C., which is typically referred to as the ADIZ. So it was Joint Army Air Defense Operations. We work pretty closely with the Air Force, the F-16s, F-22s, et cetera, based out of Andrews Air Force Base. So we actually worked very closely in a peer capacity with the pilots, because often we would get tracks and they would go up and intercept something or identify it, and we would be basically working with them in peers. So our systems were backups to their engagement capabilities. So let me just kind of, oh, by the way, I wanted to make a comment, clear something up, because a bunch of people had noted, well, the reported objects were moving U.S., Canada, and people were questioning what's the authority there. Something a lot of people don't know is that NORAD is actually a binational command. It is both U.S. and Canadian. So NORAD has the authority to issue a shoot down order for anything in U.S. or Canadian airspace. So that's not an issue. Here's a few specifics. People commented on the unidentified nature of the objects. Something I'll tell you from my experience is any object that enters U.S. airspace that is, quote, unidentified is unlikely to remain so for very long, because there are so many known radar cross sections that are easily cross-referenced against known airframes, for example. Aircraft typically have transponders. I mean, even unknown things like a flock of geese, for example. A flock of migrating geese can generate a radar cross-section, but it's typically intermittent. It doesn't last very long. And the typical end result of unknown objects or balloons or flocks of geese is somebody is sent up to intercept, aircraft is dispatched, and they go and they put eyes on it and they go, well, that's a flock of geese, and end of scenario. So a couple things on commenting on shoot down in terms of how something would be engaged. For them to order a shoot down on an object in U.S. airspace, so you would need positive ID. A couple people pointed that out, and that's absolutely correct. You would need positive ID on what you're looking at. You would need hostile declaration, which means that they have witnessed the object perform a hostile act, or they have ID'd it as something highly likely to perform a hostile act. So that has to be declared, and normally shoot down authority for something is no less than the 2-star level. That's not something a low rank, that would not be a decision a low ranking person would be authorized to make.
So based on that, they would have to know exactly what it was.
Yes, absolutely. Because
and what the threat level,
because in the event, I mean, let's say they dispatched aircraft to an unknown radar track to identify it, put eyeballs on it, and they say, okay, there's some strange balloon, some strange hovering metallic object. What they would do is typically they'd say, well, is it doing anything hostile? Is it shooting at somebody? Is it setting things on fire? If it's not doing any of that, then they would simply follow a protocol of track and report. What is it? What is it doing? Really, shooting something down is as an absolute last resort, only with positive ID.
And NORAD's never shot anything down, to my knowledge. Is that right?
Probably not. I would say during the time that I was at, probably in the last 20 years, no. There have been some close calls. One rather infamous example, there was a congressman, I forget from which state, who flew into DC without filing a flight plan and forgot to turn his transponder on, and they came real close. They were pointing things at him before they ID'd that this was somebody who had.
Sorry. What you're saying, sorry, man. What you're saying is that it's very rare for NORAD to actually shoot anything down. This is a very rare occurrence.
Very rare. Very, very unlikely that they would just go trigger happy on anything unless they've identified it.
When's the Mario? No, this is the first time ever.
I believe since World War II. I could be wrong. That's
No, over American airspace. This is the first time ever.
Yeah. So
since
like
the creation of NORAD, since the creation of NORAD, these are the first incidents where we've had shoot downs.
I mean, let me give you. Can I give you guys an example to frame this in real world terms? On 9/11, when they were talking about like the third and fourth, and these were scenarios we studied extensively. On 9/11, when they had, after the first two planes had hit, and they were talking about the third, fourth, and at one point maybe a fifth plane out there. They were trying to get authority. They had aircraft trailing them. They were trying to get shoot down authority. And at the time, there was not really a clear ROE for that. They finally decided that shoot down authority had on 9/11 had to come directly from the president, and they were not able to get that in time. They then changed it to where now it's SecDef, and then there are some appointees below him who have that domestic shoot down authority.
And also, did you hold on? Also, did you just confirm as well what Grant and Emergent mentioned, that this is the first time NORAD has ever engaged?
Yeah. I mean, this is the first time, and I think, but again, I'm going to just end up my comment. What I said earlier. I think again, the Chinese spy balloon. I think, and to Emergent's point, I think there was changes of the ROE, right? And NORAD has said, the National Security Council press secretary John Kirby said, we don't know what it was. It was an object. It was not supposed to be there. It was entering U.S. territorial waters, and we shot it down. Right? I think to Emergent's point that the Chinese spy balloon, we're all seeing the coming record. They have changed their rules of engagement, and I think now the rules of engagement are, if this is an object that's not supposed to be there, and it's entering our territorial airspace, we're going to shoot it down, because I think they don't want a repeat of the Chinese spy balloon. And I think, unfortunately, and this might be now, are we going too much, right? Are we now being too public about this? Is there's too much discussion?
But also, quick question. I've got two questions for you. So Emergent perspective did mention that for a U.S. shoot down, for the shoot down to actually take place, they have to have a positive ID, and they have to identify the flying object to likely be hostile.
That's correct.
Right. And I think Emergent is 100% correct. But the question I have is, has there been a change of ROE based on the Chinese spy balloon incident to ensure that this has? So basically, you can have a positive ID, right? You can have a positive ID, and your positive ID is this object is none of the U.S., no Canadian, no civilian purpose. It is not supposed to be here. Has there been a change of ROE at directive of the President of the United States to now saying we have engagement authorities over this airspace? And by the way, the Canadian incident, right, with the shoot down in Canada, that was coming from the request of the Canadian Prime Minister, and they also said it was a cylindrical object, or something like that.
So hold on. So also, if this is a request, from the Canadian Prime Minister, doesn't that contradict the first point? And I'm just trying to be objective here, but doesn't it contradict the first point that it's the Biden administration changing the rules of engagement, or the Air Force or changing the rules of engagement based on the Chinese spy balloon? Now you've got the Canadian Prime Minister himself requesting for the UFO to be shot down, and he doesn't have any point to prove. He didn't make any mistakes with the Chinese spy balloon. Does that make sense?
No, the Chinese spy balloon went over Canada.
That's okay. So he's getting criticism for not shooting it down as well. So you think?
And so I think I think Emergent's 100% correct. Just as there was changes after 9/11. Right. And he mentioned a perfect, delegation. That's what we call in the military, delegation of authorities at a certain level of SecDef, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And he's right. Generally, a lot of these decisions are held at higher commands. And that's why they're generals and commanders and Secretary of Defense and POTUS, because they have higher levels of responsibilities that they can assume. The question I have, and I think this is a legitimate question, and maybe we might get an answer or not, has the Chinese spy balloon, just as 9/11, changed the rules of engagement? Has the Chinese spy balloon changed the rules of engagement? I think the actions are showing that there has been, and maybe this is a more recurring thing. And the question now that we have is that the right decision? Are we overreacting? And I think that's a legitimate thing that we have to look at.
I want to go to
a quick comment on
Emergent. Yeah, Emergent. I wanted to go to you. I want you to comment on what was just said. And do you think that this plays a role in the rules of engagement? Because again, I want to go back to a point you said. A positive ID is required, and the UFO must be highly likely to be hostile. Do you think that rules of engagement could have been changed within days after the Chinese spy balloon?
So we have seen, and they do occur from time to time, special ROE within NORAD airspace, because it's a very large command in response to particular situations. I can give you pretty common examples, or things like they can institute when major national events like the Super Bowl are going on, for example. They actually institute a special flight restricted zone around the Super Bowl stadium for any objects, and they can forbid some normal air traffic, and they can institute special ROE for scenarios like that. Presidential inaugurations are another example, Super Bowl, other things like that, where they identify a large or a significant chance of there being some type of event. But those types of special ROE are normally very focused around a specific event known ahead of time. They're normally very specific, very restrictive, and they're very temporary. They always go back to the main ROE, which have been the way that it has been really, for the most part, since NORAD's founding, because there's wisdom to those rules.
Okay, breaking 4 news. I know you have an update for us real quick, and then I do have another question for emergent. So breaking, jump in.
Yeah, we are getting some new reporting, and I want to point out the timing in this reporting, which is key. The governor of Montana posted a statement on Twitter just 25 minutes ago saying, quote, "I received a briefing tonight at the White House about an object in Montana airspace. I will continue to receive regular updates." So this was posted after the NORAD report, where they said it was all clear and potentially a false alarm what was going on. So it's building on this kind of conflicting information that we're hearing from policymakers, lawmakers, and officials in the state of Montana versus NORAD and the communications that they've been providing to the American public. So it's obviously very easy to see that these situations could be like near misses, but at the same time, it's worth noting that it's just contributing to the confusion with this story.
Okay.
And I do have Joe as well just sent me some information that Air Force Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, I'll try to get him on. Oh, no, we're not going to be getting Ryder on, that's for sure. Stated that there was no indication at this point that it was maneuverable regarding the UFO that was shot down earlier, and that it had no, let me read the notes, and no indication that it had any surveillance equipment. But I just don't know what we could, what information we can trust, because we keep getting conflicting information, like the UFO above Montana. So it's hard to determine how accurate what Patrick is saying is.
Nope. I couldn't unmute. I'm sorry.
Nick, what's up?
I couldn't unmute.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, all good. All good.
So emergent.
Brett,
what?
Go ahead, bro.
Okay. Emergent. I want to ask you real quick, because you were involved with NORAD, and a big concern that people have had over the past week now that we've been tracking this, these UFO situations, a balloon and everything. Why was NORAD not able to pick up on where these UFOs came from, and how quickly should they be able to do it? How far off the coast of, say, Alaska are they actually tracking objects?
So that really depends on the specifics of the object itself. So as I said before, different objects have a different radar cross section. A balloon is going to have, for example, a much smaller radar cross section than like a Soviet MiG, right? So the general, to detect commercial aircraft and military type airframes, I mean, that capacity extends hundreds of miles out into the Atlantic and Pacific, also over the North Pole and Alaska. So generally, for a solid object like we think of an aircraft, that's generally pretty broad and unlikely for something to slip in unnoticed. But when you get to odd shaped things, when you get to things like a flock of geese, again, those things can kind of pop up and be an anomaly and go away. There's also a tuning process on any system that is used for identification. There's something called ground clutter, which is if I have a radar that's placed somewhere near tall buildings, for example, I have to carve out places on the radar picture where it doesn't pick up the building and think that that's an object in the air, right? So buildings, trees, mountains, radio towers, things like that, and you normally have different. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I'm sure we're going to have more on that. But I want to have Justin jump in here real quick before we go to the other speakers, because Justin, you actually have the clip where the U.S. congressman was on Fox News talking about the fact that he was briefed on the fact that there is a UFO currently over Montana. So if you could play that, that'd be awesome.
Let's play that real quick here.
And I guess my first question, have you guys been briefed on this matter?
I have finally, Lawrence. I will tell you that when the first balloon came across and everyone heard about it, we were clawing for information, and DOD, Pentagon was not forthcoming. Fortunately, this evening, I am back in Montana. I'm at an event, a Lincoln Reagan dinner in Columbus, Montana right now, and DOD called me as I've been sitting here and started giving me briefings to tell me what was going on. I clarified with them that this is actually the fourth balloon. Okay, so the first was shot down over the Atlantic. One was shot down before it entered into Alaska's airspace. Third was shot down, Trudeau ordered over Canada. So now we're talking about a fourth incident. And we had air traffic shut down on the northern part of the state. My report is that it has been reopened. DOD told me that they are going to be tracking the object. They can't even say exactly what it is. They're going to track the object until it gets light again. They don't have the ability to put any more eyes on it with aircraft until it's light again.
Congressman, where is the object? Where is the object? Do they know where the object? I know you say they're tracking it, but where is it right now?
It's north of Havre, Montana.
So it's still in American airspace right now. So do we anticipate that airspace being closed as well? More airspace in the country in Montana being closed?
That I do not have any additional information on, Lawrence. I can tell you the airspace has been opened back up again. They closed it originally because the object was hovering there in that prime commercial air traffic zone between 18,000 and 35,000 feet.
And Congressman, I'm assuming because you represent this area, do they plan on shooting the object down?
I will know more as it gets light again, Lawrence. Right now, they cannot bring it down in the dark. And once it gets light again, they're still monitoring exactly where it's going. They will give me more information in the morning, or if anything changes through the evening.
So, Congressman, I know
that's the end of the clip there, but yeah, balloons all around. Then, huh?
See, did I hear that, Justin? Did I hear that right? Did he refer to them as balloons?
Well, he referred to the one over Alaska as a balloon, and then the one in Montana, he kept saying all they could do is refer to it as an object,
unidentified.
Right? Yeah.
But he did confirm that the one in Alaska was a balloon, because I did hear that as well.
Yeah, I think he confirmed that the one in Alaska was a balloon.
Confirmed or misspoke? I just want to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Who knows?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Lots of confusion.
So it does seem that this interview happened after the airspace was reopened, because the original report by the DOD and the FAA was that or it was actually NORAD. I'm sorry, I'll correct myself. It was NORAD that said that there was an issue with a radar or whatever, so they were requesting that the airspace be reopened. But now that we're hearing this interview after the fact, it does seem like the congressman is pushing back on that. So, Austin, I want to bring you in here, and let's hear your thoughts on what you heard in the past few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, what's extremely clear is, especially considering the time of night, I should say, is that specifics on visual identification are going to be sparse. And what it appears to be is that the DoD is playing it a bit safe with that, which makes sense, right? Before you're going to order a shoot down of something, you should have visual identification of what it is. I'd love to hear Emergent's thoughts on this, because as he was sort of talking about earlier, you can have radar identification of something, but until you sort of send something up to take a look at it, you're not going to sort of give that issue to shoot that down unless you put the Canadian geese population at inherent risk. But I think what is clear is, as All Source was talking about previously, is with all of the hoopla that the first sort of balloon incident sort of drove up in domestic media in the U.S. and Canada, it makes sense that for one to assume that there has been a change in the ROE in regards to how NORAD deals with these incidents, as well as the strategy moving forward on whether they're to be monitored primarily and let go or shot down. And I think what we're seeing right now is sort of the after effects of this, because as Allsource also put quite clearly, you know, UAPs are not a current issue. They've been going on for a while. And at the same time, from what we've seen from the United States government in particular, is we've actually seen a softening towards releasing information regarding UAPs. I'm sure many of you remember in 2021 when the administration declassified, I believe it was 27,000 documents on U.S. intelligence information regarding unidentified aerial phenomena that was started collecting in the 1980s. So I think what we're looking at right now is we're looking at a NORAD that is being far more transparent than it typically is on some things like this, due to the amount of sort of public attention being put on it. But I would take that one step further, and when we look at sort of these incidences in general, and from what we've been seeing, it appears that these are other balloons, right? I think it's more likely than not, based upon the notes on lack of propulsion systems, the hovering tendencies. I think we're left with one of two things: either they're balloons, they're being held aloft by a lighter than air device, or they are some sort of new technology that does not obey the laws of physics or the laws of aviation. And I think it's a safer bet to assume the former. I think the next step here, and this is something in particular I'd love to hear if he's still with us, or maybe bring him back up, Piotr's comments on if this is a continued balloon campaign. I think there's only one reasonable country we could point to on that, considering the past couple of weeks, and that would be the PRC.
Okay, so let me ask real quick. Allsource, you were talking about that in order to shoot something down, that NORAD, the Department of Defense, would have to have positive identification, and Austin just referred to that as well. But when they're coming out now and saying that the origin is unknown, how can you positively identify an aircraft like that?
Actually, can you explain, Emergent? Can you explain what positively identifying would mean?
Sure. So what that normally means is, so for civilian or military aircraft, you typically have a transponder that actually identifies what it is, and anything not queued with an active transponder. So for example, military aircraft have something called mode 4, which is encrypted. So think of that like being like a police car with the lights on, meaning you're authorized to fly anywhere if you're squawking mode 4. Mode 3 is civilian aircraft. That's your civilian airliners, and they have different codes that they're assigned based on the flight activity that they're currently exhibiting or the flight plan they have filed. And those codes match a certain behavior, such as landing at X airport or taking off, departing at Y airport. So the behavior of that aircraft, for example, has to match the transponder code that they have been assigned, and the behavior. They have to be flying within a certain limit of that. And if things go off course, then that becomes kind of a flag for people to start looking at. So ID usually comes down to, obviously the easiest way is transponders. Then you have radar cross sections, and then your final is, as many people have alluded to, well, why wouldn't you shoot down something at night? Is if something, your final line is visual ID. You can send, they can send Coast Guard helicopters or F-16s or whatever's within range. They start looking at what they have in range to go intercept and do a visual ID. In the case of why wouldn't you shoot something down at night, if it's unidentifiable through other means, you would try to put an asset in the same airspace and visually identify it. In terms of you would avoid a shoot down simply because you can't get a positive ID. Now, there might be an exception to that. For example, if we're talking about an object flying over the woods in Montana, it's not really, it's again, we're defining hostile as certain behavior and certain intent, which gets to very complex definitions that we can't really go into here. But for example, it would be a different scenario if the object is unknown, unidentifiable because it's at night and it's hovering over some random woods in Montana versus it's approaching the state capitol building at a speed of 400 knots, right? Because then we're saying it is approaching a specific object or something of interest at a high velocity, right? So that's
Emergent. Let me ask you this as well, because this is a question that we're getting a lot from the audience, and I do want the audience to go down there in that bottom right-hand corner, because we're going to be going here for a long time. I need your questions for the panel. But Emergent, one of the most prominent things that people have been talking about since the first balloon was discovered is how were they unable to find these, to track these, to know exactly where they came from? Because we're talking about unknown origins now. Is the U.S. government not able to find out where these actually flew from? Because clearly they didn't come from, the areas that they were found in.
From my experience, to be honest with you, that just doesn't sound like a very likely scenario, because anytime an object enters U.S. airspace, there's a database that shows there's lots of data that is collected. It's including point of origin. You can go back and say, okay, this object's flying over, or close to New York City, and you can look at the track history over the last 8 to 10 hours and see, it entered U.S. airspace near Seattle, for example, or over the West Coast. So you can see track history, especially tied to, you can see transponder code changes, track history, altitude changes, any significant changes to a radar cross section. There's a lot of data there, so I find it very unlikely that they would actually ever be in a scenario where we have no idea where something came from.
Emergent, would you say it's more likely that they're not, it's too early to start pushing blame to another country, and this could cause geopolitical issues? So
sure.
It's more likely that they know where these objects came from. It's just it's not it's not a good idea to start pointing fingers so early.
Sure, and I would also say it might be information they could have political reasons to want to suppress. Right.
I want to mention that there was a report sent to me by Joa Santos, again NPR report, titled I'll tweet about it in a bit. The Pentagon got hundreds of new reports of UFOs in 2022. It's a government report. And in that report, let me read out exactly what he said. Almost half of UFO reports are balloons or balloon-like. So, number one, is that common, or is that just recent from from what you've read? Because I know you haven't worked at the Air Force for about 8 years. So that's question number one. And question number two: is it possible that balloons, for the balloon to go over Canada for so long, is it possible that that balloon was not spotted earlier? Or do you think Canada spotted that first balloon relatively early and just let it go on for a while, just to observe, observe what it's doing, observe its direction, etc.?
So to the first part of your question, small balloons, even things like if something like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon got loose, right? Objects like that have gotten loose in U.S. airspace and have been tracked on radar. And they'll do reports for those things and make sure they know what it is. So it's actually not uncommon. Actually, probably the biggest development in the last 10 years is small civilian-owned drones, because those can create some. And again, we go to something like a national event like a presidential inauguration or a Super Bowl, where they do have serious concerns about somebody showing up with one of those drones and buzzing it into obviously airspace, it could just be some kid that wants to get pictures of the event, but then they have concerns about that. And so that scenario has become a lot more common in the last 10 years. Balloons have always been common. That's not a recent development. And I would say to the second part of your question, as the initial Chinese balloon, I suspect that the Canadian NORAD sections probably, and I haven't looked at the flight path recently, but wherever it entered NORAD airspace, they probably picked it up pretty early. Likely, if it came over the North Pole, they could have. There's massive amount of monitoring of that airspace, because that was always during the Cold War. That was always.
Then why this sudden escalation now? Why suddenly now there's UFOs everywhere? And I know we've got other speakers that we just brought up. We'll go to you guys in a bit. But why suddenly now you've got all these UFOs being spotted and shot down?
I don't think it's an escalation necessarily, right? I think that this was a response to the public's anger at the fact that a Chinese spy balloon was allowed to fly over, American soil for 4 days straight without any kind of response. And so this is I would say it's a reaction to that, to hit it off at the pass, so to speak.
Actually, Ian, that sounds very credible to me. To be honest, hearing all of this, I think some people have gone crazy with the UFO alien stuff, and I don't think I'm really not thinking there's a lot of credibility to that. But I do think it's quite likely. My best guess, and don't take me as, obviously I'm not sitting in front of a radar screen, and I don't know all of this, but my best educated guess that I would put my money on is that they were probably running some kind of exercise or drill using drones, and it's gotten out of control. We know how the media is now, with taking something and spiraling out with, spiraling out of control with misinformation and narratives, and that's what this is to me until we really get strong confirmation. Otherwise, I think the likelihood of some unknown. I just, from my experience, that's really pretty unthinkable that something we have no idea how or where this entered the airspace. Just not a credible story to me at all.
All source, you want to add to it?
Sorry,
go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, before we go to all source, just last question for you, Emergent. What's your concern level right now out of 10? 1 being not concerned at all, and 10 being extremely concerned. Where were you when the first balloon was shut down? Where are you at now? And what will get you to let's say an 8 or a 9? I don't think you're there already, unless you are.
I would say I was. I think I was listening to I think it was one of your spaces the other day with Dr. Gorka got up and said it comes across more like a publicity stunt on the part of the Chinese to do this for publicity and provocation reasons. Because they have satellites that can get more detailed imagery. I mean, unless there's some specific thing that the balloon could collect info on that otherwise, I'm really not too concerned. I think it's more of a publicity stunt. I think what's going on right now is probably more misinformation, but anything's possible, and I'm keeping my ear to the ground just like the rest of you. But my concern level right now is pretty low. I'm more concerned that disinformation and overreaction to it is where I'm at.
And you mentioned Dr. Gorka. He's in the. I've just sent him an invite, Dr. Gorka. If you want to come up, I've just DM'd you an invite. Oh, I've just sent you a request. And what escalation, before we go to all source? What escalation would be like? Okay, shit. Now I'm at a 7 or an 8 concern level.
I would say a sighting, if something happened, within close proximity, if an actual hostile act was confirmed within close proximity to something that is of serious national security interests, like military base, major city, that type of thing, that's more where I'd be elevating my concern level.
Also, I know that Justin has a few clips to play for us before we go to Mr. Weinstein. Also, anything to add to what was mentioned by Emergent?
Yeah, so I think multiple things, right? I think there's a lot of ways that the U.S. can track stuff that is not only limited to radar. There's a lot of intelligence capabilities that we have that can synchronize and provide a better picture, right? So we're not just limited on radar. There's intel platforms that are very good at providing a clearer picture to see kind of what's going on. And that's kind of to back up to Emergent's point. I think from a term of escalation, et cetera, and if there's a concern, again, I think we just have to wait for more public information. I think the issue we're running into is that we're being, the U.S. government, NORAD, is being very public with everything that is going on, when a lot of the time these incidents probably wouldn't have just received that much publicity. And I think that's causing a lot of concerns. Again, we just don't know.
What do you mean? But just quickly, what do you mean they don't get that much publicity? If this is the first time NORAD ever engages, it's not something that happens.
But I think the China, again, just like I pointed there, the Chinese spy balloon changed the calculus to Emergent and Point. I think Emergent hit it again, because of the Chinese spy balloon incident. Now NORAD is being a lot more aggressive, and so as such is getting a lot more publicity. And when they're doing this engagements, they're publicly acknowledging it. Right. Again, that's something else that is new. And I think the more publicity is maybe causing people to be more concerned. But one of the things we've seen is that the U.S. government has been public about this. And as such, I don't think they're trying to hide anything. And I think we just have to wait for a little bit more information to get a better understanding, because there's just too much unknowns.
I think he's right. And one thing I'll just point out is when they would run, for example, exercises in D.C., they would run they would have, Civil Air Patrol pilots, fly in and do a simulated type of engagement. And those types of things were actually published, and you can go find them yourself. Go do a search for DC ADIS Falcon Virgo. They actually run these NORAD exercises in DC area. They actually run those exercises very frequently, and they publish them well ahead of time just to make sure that the public, if they see a Cessna with F-16s tailing it, flying in DC airspace, that nobody freaks out and calls 911 and thinks that something crazy is going on. So they do publicize things like that, and they actually do keep in mind that there is a public perception and that has to be managed. So that is another element to this.
Justin, before I go to Eric, I wanted to give you the mic to play some clips for us that you've got prepped.
Yeah, just real quick, here's a general trying to explain what happened.
The balloon was somehow able to get past our West Coast anti-balloon defense system, the Seattle Space Needle.
Oh, sorry. That was Keenan Thompson on this. So no, actually one of the better jokes this week. Little levity just to bring in the real big guns now. This is retired General Anthony Tata. He's a Fox News contributor, but he also has some deep experience. This is his take just within the hour on what he thinks is going on here. He's talking about both the Alaska and Montana incident. Let's listen in.
Has addressed the American people about this very real threat to the United States. And it's been, you look at Twitter, and I agree with you, you have to sort of dismiss that because you just have all the information keyboard warriors there they dismiss this out of hand, like, well, you got satellites, why do they need to send balloons? You've really got to take a serious look at this and why China would be sending these balloons into our airspace. And, last week when we talked, Lawrence, I talked about probing the wire. When I was a commander in Afghanistan, the Taliban would probe the wire to see how you responded. They would send some new recruits in to cut the wire of your base camp, and your weapons would light up. And so they would pinpoint where your weapons were. At a strategic level, China is probing the wire to see how we respond.
I think that's a really interesting take. The analogy, I think, is apt there. They really do seem to be.
When was that? When was that, Justin?
This was just within the last hour. That was on the Dan Bongino show.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very good take, and I've most of the folks I know in the military right now, that's the general consensus right now.
And Justin, you got another clip as well?
Yeah, here's one more clip. This is the spokesperson for the Canadian Prime Minister talking about what they're doing next on this particular object, which was shot down.
Recovery operations are now underway and will be supported by the Canadian Armed Forces in conjunction with the RCMP. This coordinated operation will allow a further investigation into this object. We have no further details about the object at this time, other than it appears to be a small cylindrical object and smaller than the one that was downed off the coast of North Carolina. There is no reason to believe that the impact of the object in Canadian territory is of any public concern.
So that was her take on it. Again, it sounds like a balloon, but they keep, obviously for technical purposes, they refer to it as an object. Things are still being identified, but as we heard from the briefing that the congressman in Montana received, it sounds like these are balloons all the way down.
One question to Emergent before I go to Mr. Weinstein. You did mention that other people in the military that you've spoken to do believe that this is just China probing U.S. defense system. Is that what you meant?
Yes, I think probing probably more in terms of response to see what both politically how it's handled, but probably also just to see it's an opportunity for them to test capability. I mean, wasn't this one of the first times that the F-22 was actually sent up and an AIM-9X was used on that? So for them, that's data collection, right?
That's ballsy. That takes some guts.
I mean, it's smart, right?
Eric,
intelligence, because there's no other way to get
I don't know.
because no one's ever used this before.
Yeah,
no one's ever used this before, and
not in this sort of situation where they can directly probe the capabilities of the F-22. Thus far, the only thing we know about the F-22 is the stuff that the United States government itself releases, and they're not going to tell the world, much less China, what its capabilities are. So to see it in person, so to speak, it's a good way to gauge how powerful it is.
It goes to the question I had for you, Eric. Your thoughts on what's happening right now, and I was just in one of our groups right now. The team just sent me through an article by Military Times. National Guard preps for potential Arctic conflicts with Russia, China. Again, I'm not mentioning it to create fear or anything. I'm just reading out, some of the articles and the narratives we're seeing in the media. Would love your thoughts on all this, Eric. What are your thoughts on the escalation we're seeing? We saw that there's obviously the war in Ukraine that's escalating, and this NATO support to Ukraine, and now we're seeing escalating tensions with China.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I guess what I think is that we've settled into several new normals, which have not been really declared. I believe that the rules of engagement probably did change, and that we don't have a clear idea of how our outcry might have affected the political calculations of the commander-in-chief. In my opinion, what's happened is that we've settled into this new normal of preposterous statecraft narratives that might have been, I don't know, vaguely believable in a time before we were all able to communicate with each other, but no longer really get the trust of intelligent people thinking critically. So we don't really have a clear idea about the UFO UAP issue as regards non-human intelligence. There's this whole taxonomy that we forget in the first report, where 4 of the 5 branches are completely prosaic relative to the 5th branch, which is just called other. And the purpose of doing that was to make the sexiest thing sound the most banal. We also have this weird thing you can check in your mind, that when you hear the words UFO, you don't actually think UFO, you think flying saucer and aliens, when in fact it just means, as others have stated, unidentified flying object. And I would also say that there's sort of a limited number of shapes that most things are going to be configured in. They're going to be either configured in spherical shapes, or, sort of cylindrical, or wedges or whatever. And we all associate those with various grainy videos that we've been watching for ages on the alien front, wondering if these things are real CGI or a giant psyop. So I think what's happening is you're seeing a collision between all of these preposterous narratives, from the way that we're not allowed to question the Ukraine narrative, even though it involves nuclear conflict, and we're treating it as if it was an early 20th century war, in which we're going to back Putin into a conventional corner, because of course he could never do anything other than resign, which is not, it's a very bizarre thing. So when people are afraid that we're going to suddenly have this end to the calm that followed World War II, and that none of the narratives make sense. Kamala Harris is widely not thought to be capable of assuming the rigors of this job, and Joe Biden, may have competency issues, being over 80 and by far the oldest president we've ever elected. I think what you're seeing is that people are waking up to the idea that these presidential elections, which didn't seem to matter all that much, really matter. We may be in a completely different regime. And all of these trust-destroying statecraft narratives, which everyone can see are false, but nobody can get on the right channel to challenge, we're now aware that somehow we don't actually have news sources except for this crowdsourced stuff, which is why there's so many people here. And so I think that that's what's happening, is that we allowed our government to continue doing what it had always done, but now in an era of social media where we can all compare notes, realize that they're lying, and that we now fear that none of this makes sense. And the last thing I would just close with is, it's completely irresponsible not to let us know that these objects were drifting with the air mass, right? So if you have a balloon, in many ways, it has very different characteristics than a jet or something like that, or a rocket. And as a result, somebody should just very quickly say that there is absolutely no sign of extraordinary physics with respect to these objects, so that we can simply shut down this thing that's in everybody's head, which is that we've heard way too much about really bizarre UFOs, and now we're in a situation in which we have a cylindrical object, which sounds like a tic tac or a cigar-shaped object from days of yore. And I just think it's completely irresponsible for these governments, if they know these things to be relatively conventional, to not say something, because they must know everybody's going to speculate. Thanks very much.
I've got two questions for you, Eric. First, Emergent, I want you to comment on the last point that Eric made before I ask my two questions.
I'm sorry, I had stepped away for a second. Could you give me just a quick summary?
No, good. I'll do that in a bit. Eric, you mentioned the settling. We've settled to new normals. Can you elaborate on this point? Because I was going to ask you about it before you even started speaking, and that was the first thing you mentioned. What is this new normal?
Essentially, the new normal, so far as I can tell, is that the government embarks on some program that it claims is in our communal best interest. Many of us fear that it is in the best interest of the ruling class, because so many of our top politicians have become fabulously wealthy and we can't quite figure out what's going on. So we have a serious breach of trust because we think we have a principal agent problem where our agents, that is our elected representatives, don't represent us. And what they do is they say, we're going to embark on some program, for example, whatever the EcoHealth Alliance does in Wuhan, China, funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And none of us exactly understand what this thing is. We don't really believe the cover story. We don't know if, in fact, this is good for us because we found a workaround around the bioweapons convention that we need, or we don't know whether Peter Daszak is endangering us, let's say. Same thing would be true for Epstein. Same thing would be true for changes in the M1 money supply, where it's denied that this has anything to do with inflation. So the result is that the government keeps taking action accompanied by a narrative that is absolutely not believable. And the news sources that used to give us a sense of sense-making and analyzing these things are clearly playing on the side of the government. So effectively, what you have is that the referees are clearly on the side of one team, where the public feels, how did this country for and of the people slip away from us? And the result of allowing these narratives that don't make sense to accompany very dangerous and very bizarre actions that can be seen by all is this radical erosion of trust, where people want to lump them all together. Many people think that what's going on with these shoot downs, for example, they're writing to me saying, this is because we're about to get the Epstein list and that we need a massive distraction. And you'll hear people say, oh, that's a controlled opposition, that's a limited hangout, useful idiots. We've all adopted the PSYOP level where we're armchair amateur defense spooks, where we're trying to say, oh, you're so stupid that you believe that, because nobody knows what to believe, because our media is continuing with the same way that they used to present things, but in an era where we can compare notes, and now we know that they're absolutely lying.
I want to ask you one more question. I know there's some more news to share. One more question, Eric. The other new normal that I wanted to comment on as well is the geopolitical normalcy that we're seeing. We've got I was just researching the Nord Stream explosion that happened a few months ago, because we're doing a space on it in a couple of weeks. And, you've got the Ukraine conflict. You got Zelensky was in, I can't remember which country he was in. And he was urging a few European nations to provide, or NATO to provide jets to Ukraine. Obviously, we've got Russian nuclear readiness on the rise. That was increased a few months ago. And now you've got China potentially probing U.S. capabilities, defense capabilities, and their political response with the balloons. And that was the point that Emergent was making earlier. This is for me, this is the story that concerns me the most at the moment. And how we're seeing an escalation among the three superpowers in our world. Does that particular point concern you? Should it concern the financial world? Should it concern the world? Or this is just political bickering and nothing to be worried about?
I don't know why you're stopping at 3. I mean, I'm worried about the India-Pakistan border, what Iran is going to do next. And the concern is that the more thinly we are stretched, particularly by sending arms and things, the greater the probability that opportunists will increase the number of theaters. And because a highly nonlinear situation where you have multiple theaters in play, and what happens in one affects what happens in the other, This is where I don't understand the isolationist perspective, because these oceans that the U.S. is protected by are not going to function in a modern world the way they might have functioned in the 1700s. I'm absolutely convinced that it's not three superpowers, but you're talking about a multipolar world where the U.S. is fatigued. It's retreating from the responsibilities of maintaining a world with as few poles as possible after World War II, because we're all just sick of the job. And we're going to be reminded that what we've lived through is the most anomalous era of peace and relative calm, save some horrible things that happened a long time ago in China in the Great Leap Forward. We are completely unprepared for what it means to live on this planet with the toys that we've come up with. And I absolutely think the worst thing that can happen is that the number of theaters goes up to 5 or 6, and we're going to be punch drunk where we can't see straight.
I remember the narrative of the hope that we would never face a world war again, thanks to globalization and the interconnectedness of the world. And that narrative seems to be crumbling every month for the past few months. And this doesn't help. So do you think that we'll see any economic impact from these escalations, or it's too early to see such impact?
I think you're going to. I hope that the worst of our concerns is an economic impact. I'm really just thinking that most of us have an idea that if something hasn't happened in 20 years, then it's never going to happen, and if something has never happened, it's not worth worrying about. And I really think that history is going to be restarting this century in earnest, and we're completely unprepared as humans for what that actually looks like.
Justin, I know you had a quick clip you wanted to play for us before I continue with more questions. Then we'll go to Austin just for a quick update. And we'll go actually to Matthias for a quick update on any developments. Justin?
Yeah, going back to General Tata, he's going to basically just talk about kind of what his perception is of how, again, I think what Brett alluded to, some of the administration lapse here. Hang on one second.
We still haven't heard anything from the President of the United States. And apparently Lucas is the only one that's on the White House lawn to give us some information.
Right. Yeah, hey, Lawrence, Lucas does a great job. And, as he was talking, it occurred to me that recall that during the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle, the entire administration was on vacation. You had Blinken in the Hamptons. You had the president at his place in Delaware. Everybody was on vacation as this happened. And then, and there was zero communication with the American people. Then when the Ukraine-Russia war was about to begin, the administration offered Zelensky a ride out instead of taking a whole look at what's happening there, because their intelligence was so bad that they thought it was going to be over in 72 hours and Russia was going to own Ukraine. And now they're not communicating. We have a repeated penetration of U.S. sovereign airspace by an adversary that's listed in the National Defense Strategy as our #1 competitor in the world. And the president's at a party, and there's zero communication with the American people.
I think that's a valid critique. There's, I think people really want to mirror the sort of things they want from their government to mirror that sort of anxiety and anxiousness they have around these things. More communication, more information, I think, will be vital for that. And I think it'll dissipate a lot of the tension that people feel. I mean, look, we got 18,000. I think at one point we hit 20,000 people listening to this live. That's one of our biggest shows ever, and it's pretty impactful. I think if you kind of are just tuckered away and dining with people at these different events around the country, gosh, I think a lot of feedback I'm getting is people really need to get on the ball and communicate what is actually happening here.
And before I continue asking questions, and for the audience members, anyone that just joined, bottom right corner is where you can ask questions. And Matthias, can you give the audience an overview of what we know so far? What are the facts that we know so far? Matthias?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm here. Basically, what's been developing this afternoon and this evening is that a third unidentifiable object was shot down in a joint military operation by the U.S. and Canada, specifically over the Yukon. That's the portion of Canada that was affected by this. We know via a Wall Street Journal report citing U.S. sources familiar with the situation that this was in fact a quote metallic balloon with some sort of a payload underneath it. Those are the details that have been confirmed on the Canada situation, but not necessarily confirmed on the situation that we have on the coast of Alaska, which was downed Friday afternoon. Additionally, what's occurring tonight, which has created a very confusing situation, is that several hours ago, we heard reports of fighter jets being scrambled on our west coast. And then we had the FAA issue a NOTAM and a airspace closure over Montana, which within about an hour of that issuance was retracted and all operations were resumed. Now, during that time, we had lawmakers who represent Montana, both senators and congressmen and women, as well as the governor of Montana, specifically saying that they were briefed on another object that's unidentifiable over Montana airspace, and that due to the fact that this was discovered at night, the military cannot take further action and will resume their operation in the morning. However, we then received contradicting information from NORAD, which said that this was basically a false alarm and a radar-triggered abnormality that they investigated and then pulled back their operation based on the fact that nothing was found. So it's a very confusing situation with a lot of dynamics. Obviously, we're at a heightened state of alert given the situation last week with the Chinese spy balloon downed off the Carolina coast in the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the discovery that balloon wasn't the first, it wasn't the second. There were several, and it's part of a much larger campaign by China to spy on countries throughout the world. So clearly, we're all at a heightened state of readiness, a heightened state of alert, and that's why we see an uptick in this.
Mateus, one more question. I see Nick
Absolutely.
unmuting, so I'll give him the mic in a bit. One more question to you, and then we'll go to Rose Alerts as well, who's been covering the story with us. Mateus, the question to you is: there were reports of more balloons that were spotted around the world, including Latin America, over the last few days. Can you give us a bit more context there?
What I can confirm for you is that at the same time as we were dealing with our balloon, the final days, as it was kind of in the southeast United States and then off our coast where it was down, is that Costa Rica was dealing with a similar balloon. And then the Pentagon later confirmed earlier this week that 40 countries have reported, not all at the same time, but in general, this kind of campaign by China with these surveillance balloons, and several of them.
Okay, so I'm gonna. Your mic is a bit muffled, Mateus. Rose Alerts. Anything that Mateus missed? Anything you'd like to add before I ask another question for Emergent? And I see we've got OSINT Defender on stage as well. But go ahead, Rose Alerts. Anything to add that Breaking 4 News missed?
No, he did an excellent job. I'm just checking through the feed if there's any new updates or anything like that. But yeah,
appreciate you both. Just a massive shout out to you both because you've been feeding us all the information and validating any information that we get before we share it on space. So appreciate you. Nick, I want to ask one more question to Emergent, and I'll give you the mic, Nick, if you don't mind. Just one more question, Emergent. We've had. So from no one talking about balloons, no one knowing anything about balloons, to suddenly a balloon appearing in the U.S. and being shot down, to now there's balloons all around the world, or at least being reported around the world by 40 countries, as Mateus just mentioned, and now we're seeing the UFOs in various locations in the U.S. My question here is, did the Air Force, did the intelligence know all this beforehand, and we're only finding out in recent days? Or is it possible that after spotting that one balloon, I know I kind of touched on that question earlier, after spotting that one balloon and shooting it down about a week ago, that now they've been paying more attention to objects that fit that description and now we know that there's more Chinese spy balloons in the different locations, including Latin America.
I just wanted to say that is very possible that during different events, like I said, high profile national events like Super Bowl or presidential inauguration or anything that might indicate a heightened security state, they do sometimes elevate the posture. They also can change standing orders. Usually those things are short term and temporary, but it's not impossible that some kind of elevated stature or the added publicity could cause, I wouldn't say, I don't think it would be very likely that anybody would go trigger happy because there's too many safeguards in place to prevent that, but maybe alert happy might be a better term. So for example, people might be more likely to, report a radar anomaly, for example. And like we said, that can be many things. That can be clutter. That can even be, systems that, for example, normally a track is correlated on multiple radar sources before it appears as part of an air picture to make sure you don't have a glitch on one system. So, I mean, things like that could be, there could be heightened awareness because of the publicity surrounding this. Also, as I said, there can be things like exercises, and it could even be it could even be that another unit is doing an exercise that NORAD wasn't really strongly briefed on that they could have an overreaction to. That's also a possibility.
The question I want to go to Adam on this question as well. Guys, for this, I don't know how serious is it that this is the first time NORAD ever engages? Because Emergent, you were pretty relaxed earlier that you weren't too alarmed by these developments, and you think this is just China probing U.S. defense capabilities. But for NORAD to engage for the first time, why wouldn't they, after the Chinese balloon and China being very apologetic and unusually apologetic before the US shut it down? Why, if there are these unidentified objects, including that balloon up in Canada that was shut down earlier today, that metallic balloon, why would NORAD engage rather than communicate with China and say, hey guys, you got all these balloons here, we shot one down, you gotta get your objects out of our airspace. I know we're just assuming that this is China, but this is a speculation we can make considering what we know.
Maybe it's not Chinese.
Adam.
Well, I'd say NORAD wouldn't really be the one to handle the diplomatic angle there. They're really more of a.
But wouldn't NORAD need some authority before shooting down a UFO in unidentified
Yes, that is
flying
absolutely
object?
correct. Positive ID, hostile declaration, and
hostile and that hostile declaration. Can you define it again, especially for people that just joined? So hostile declaration is required for NORAD to engage. So
correct.
Can you give us examples of hostile declarations? Serious ones, obviously, and ones that are not too serious, but that would still count as hostile declaration for them to be shut down.
So normally, if something enters U.S. airspace and it's unidentified, it would normally be treated as unidentified or unfriendly, and they would try to make a positive ID. Normally, hostile declaration would only come after they've positively identified it as a hostile aircraft and/or with hostile intent. Or, for example, if something were to commit a hostile act, some aggressive things might qualify, such as painting another aircraft with targeting radar under certain circumstances, firing a missile, or flying into restricted airspace without authorization. It's a series of criteria, and it's not really a one-dimensional thing. But typically it requires an actual hostile act or demonstrable hostile intent before that would be declared. It's a pretty stringent criteria.
Yeah, Adam, I want to go to you quickly. Like, why again? If I want to speculate that this is a Chinese UFO, Chinese balloon, with the intention to spy, why would NORAD engage? Why wouldn't, after what happened with the Chinese balloon a week ago? Again, I'm speculating here that it is Chinese. Maybe I should stop doing so. Adam, tell me if I should. What your thoughts are? But if it is Chinese, why wouldn't China just get their flying objects out of the U.S. airspace? And the reason I'm asking these questions, I want to know how concerned should I be in? And it just, for me, it would sound concerning that after their balloon was shot down, they still have flying objects over the US and Canada. It just shows that the audacity they have is very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, China has shown a flagrant disregard for other countries' sovereignty in the past. But like part of the reality with these balloons, which are largely being carried by the current, is the air currents, is that they are unguided, right? They can't necessarily be retrieved by foreign power. They don't probably even
This,
have
but,
a transponder.
but this is a weird. Why would it, I'll let you continue? But why would they be unguided? Again, Emergent mentioned that it's relatively easy for defense air system or air defense systems to spot unidentified flying objects or anything within the U.S. airspace. So knowing this fact, why would any country have balloons that they cannot maneuver? And again, Joao Santos did send us an article confirming, or I can't remember what it was, but we did confirm earlier that the flying object that was shot down in Canada also did not have maneuvering capabilities.
Right.
So why would they do that?
Well, it would basically reduce its ability to be detected, right? These things, at least the first balloon that we know of that was shot down off the coast of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, was flying at up in above 60,000 feet at various points of time. It wasn't really being sought after. It's not a conventional method of espionage, and these are quite obviously probably cheaper than throwing a satellite up into space to do some of the same the surveillance, right? So you're putting it through the air currents, knowing that because of how the winds work up at those altitudes, it will cross over a large swath of important parts of the United States, and they have some limited ability to self-guide while they're up there. And I think that's very critical to understand. And it raises two very important questions. One is, where are these being launched from, right? I don't know very much about wind currents up at that altitude, but I can't foresee them being launched from mainland China. And I think someone mentioned earlier possibly the North Pole. And number two, the other question, other than antagonizing the United States, and this is something that's been speculated about before, is what is the actual Chinese ability to do imagery and signals intelligence collection from the United States? And just given their inability to put satellites into space at the kind of the rate that the United States has been able to do so, for military purposes, it actually seems to me that this is actually becoming a primary way that they're looking to expand their collections on the United States. To me, I actually think these are legitimate attempts to collect on the United States, and not only are those things a hazard to the U.S. national security, but also the fact that they do periodically cross into air traffic lanes actually causes them to be a danger to normal commercial transit. Okay, Osing, jump in here. Welcome to the stage. Maybe.
Osing Defender, you there?
A little note while they're coming up, just to show you kind of how ahead of the game we are, or maybe we're the only ones who are really interested in this topic. CNN has moved on. They have playing the history of sitcoms. MSNBC is doing a special on immigration and the challenges that lawyers face. And even Fox News moved on to the fight around New York and Florida.
But why? So this is that's weird. Like, yeah, but why? Am I missing something? Because this is the first time NORAD ever engages. We're seeing an escalation of hostilities between when the last Chinese balloon was covered nonstop and it was all over the news. Now suddenly you've got another one shot down in Canada and one over Montana that they're waiting to shoot down tomorrow morning. That's why I was asking the questions earlier to Adam and Emergent, just to understand how serious this should be taken. I'll try to find Piotr and bring him up because it'd be good to get his perspective on this. But otherwise, Awesome Defender, I saw you were able to unmute. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
No, I'm just saying it's a little pathetic. I just posted to the Nest this video that's on TikTok making the rounds from some Chinese account. Basically, they mocked up the F-22 trying to go after the balloon, and the balloon evading all its missiles and everything else there. I mean, I think part of it is it's probably on the whole, as you step back, a little frankly embarrassing right? This entire endeavor that we're all up in arms over these balloons. But I think a lot of us in the know here, and a lot of great experienced speakers on stage now, they've conveyed that this is a premise to something probably quite larger, and that it should be taken seriously. But I think the main networks don't quite know how to handle it.
I would actually disagree on that, on multiple points, right? If you're looking at what CNN, what Fox, what MSNBC is covering, I think we've actually well established that, and I think we've had an issue over the last hour or so. I think we've been jumping so quickly from point to point, we haven't been able to conduct sort of proper analysis on each one of these things. If you're looking at it from the perspective of a major news organization, right? I think we've well established that there's been a change in the ways that the DoD and the government has addressed these sorts of incidents as a result of the sheer amount of public attention that's being put on them. Mario, as you mentioned, this is the first case of a NORAD shootdown over not just the continental United States, but in the area that is under NORAD. And I think a large thing that has to do with that has to be based upon public attention. So I think it's very clear, but also, if we want to talk about sort of like breaking updates and everything like that, I think we've also sort of well established that, what was the cause of the shoot downs over Alaska and the Yukon in Canada. We've established what's the situation ongoing right now in Montana. And so I think it would be actually irresponsible of, MSNBC, Fox, CNN, and so on and so forth to continue running, end to end, these sort of, we've got a camera looking into the night sky in Montana and this, everything, right? Because what would that do? That would drive panic. But there are a couple of other points I really want to touch on. Number one, I think this issue in particular, if it is the PRC behind it, is almost entirely dependent upon U.S.-China relations and what we've seen, not just over the past 2 weeks, but over the past 6 months. I think it has little, as we heard some previous speakers talk about, the war in Ukraine. I think it has little to nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. I think it has little to nothing to do, if it is the PRC, with what's been going on in the past 2 weeks with Israel and Iran. I don't believe the Chinese legitimately think that the United States' involvement in other world affairs is their chance to fit a balloon through our integrated air defense network. That's simply not how these things run. But moving forward, and another point I'd like to say is that, it was posited that the first balloon was a way to sort of look into the F-22 system and get sort of data on that. There's nothing to my understanding that could have been grabbed from that balloon that the Chinese would not have been able to get through either, number one, their actually quite extensive human intelligence network. Number two, their even further extensive signals intelligence network, or something that isn't sort of already public on the F-22 system itself. What's secret about the F-22 is not its, the altitude at which it flies, nor the speed at which it flies, nor the weapons that it carries. What's secret about it is what makes it stealthy. It is the specific sort of compounds that are put on that aircraft that allow it to evade radar detection. That is the biggest thing with the F-22. And there's nothing that I've seen so far in regards to any sort of equipment that could have been put on a Chinese balloon that would have been able to determine a compound of that nature. So I'm extremely sort of apprehensive to this notion that this is like a long con by the PRC. They're actually getting more out of a balloon with a couple of cameras and some other sort of sensors, whether that's SIGINT or is based on image intelligence on the F-22 platform. I think it was more so just, the Air Force decided that the F-22 was the best system for that. And also, the Air Force has been sort of pumping up the image of the F-22 since its introduction in 2005. And so I think it looks good for the United States to use a platform like that. I think what's more so the case is because of the publicity of that initial balloon. We've seen a change in how the DoD is dealing with this. We're seeing more transparency than normal and more updates that the public just generally isn't used to from an organization such as NORAD. And I'd like to hear Emergent comment on that point particularly. And as a result of that, we are seeing more of these cases of, eventually resulting in a change of ROE to shoot downs.
It's interesting to point out that when the Chinese balloon was first identified, like last week, it was almost immediately identified by the U.S. government as a Chinese spy balloon. With these 3 incidents today and yesterday, we're not seeing that identification as being Chinese. So there's
Yeah,
a
but
realistic
Ian, what's the
possibility it's not
major
even
difference
Chinese.
between no? What's the major difference was that the Chinese recognized it as their own balloon publicly, right?
Yeah, they did.
You know,
Yeah.
you can fly up. You know, hang on. You can fly up and look at a balloon and say that's a balloon, but until that thing is brought down, or unless there's a giant PRC flag on the side of the balloon, it's actually quite difficult unless it's already a previously identified airframe to put that towards a specific country. If I fly a Cessna 152 over Canada and put nothing on it, there's no reason the Canadian government would believe that that's an Iranian Cessna 152 unless they bring that thing down and there are specific elements of that equipment that are inherently Iranian. That's why the major difference between the Chinese balloon last week and what we're looking at right now is the fact that the Chinese government recognized it as their own.
Yeah, so before we go to emergent, because I definitely want your feedback on this, Alex, you've been paying a lot of attention to this story. I've seen you've been tweeting all day about it. What's your overall opinion on what you've seen today and the administration's response, the DoD's response?
Hey, so what I'll say is it's pretty interesting. I think Mario picked up on this. I've been like half paying attention because I was at dinner. But we went from experts like Adam Kinzinger, self-proclaimed experts on this type of stuff, saying that these things are unmissable, that they're too high. Well, the first one at least. And then the next day they ended up shooting it down. And also how that was unprecedented. And then at the same time, they're like, oh, this is very normal. We have these things, you know, over our heads all the time. We just don't hear about it. And like Mark Milley and like the military saying, oh, we just don't report it to the public unless, you know, there's a reason for them to be like alerted. And now, like we've seen in the past week, we're seeing multiple, and we have another shoot down, and then a potential what we had tonight could have been another shoot down, but you know they were saying it's too dark. It could be a shoot down tomorrow morning if they confirm that. How like very quickly it's changed from it's very unprecedented, and we want to make sure that like it's going to pose risk to civilians before we take any sort of action. It could be seen as like an escalation towards foreign power, but now we're on the verge of potentially shooting down a third one. It's just very interesting to me how we went from this is normal, it's all like, you know, we're seeing this all the time, to now in a week we've seen 4 possibly, and we're almost going to have 3 shoot downs. That to me is just very odd. And then also tonight, how we're having, you know, we had that statement come out saying that was like a false alarm, but then we're having a congressman on live TV saying that he just got off the phone with DoD, and they're saying that's not the case. They're saying that they did see an object and that they cannot make a shoot down in the dark, and they're going to track it throughout the night and wait until the morning. So like all of this is very strange, and I'm confused as to why we're seeing conflicting information from the DoD briefing a congressman, and let me see the organization who put out the statement. I did tweet it.
It was NORAD, the FAA.
Yeah, NORAD, and yep, U.S. Northern Command. So that's just my observation from, you know, past couple days. And then the other thing too, I'll say is, like the first balloon, they wouldn't have addressed it had the public not, like, you know, asked about it. And on Friday, yesterday, they weren't even going to tell the public about it. I don't think they were asked about it. So that like raises some questions, because they're only telling us when the public is asking about these things.
Do you think, Alex, this has gotten a little bit political now? Is that what you're saying? That it seems like maybe the administration is acting based on politics?
Yes, and I've had a bunch of comments about like the Trudeau shooting down. They're like, now I feel like this is like a PR thing, because it's like, now they're like, oh, me, like Biden, it's like, oh yeah, me and Trudeau are like protecting, you know, North America's skies together, blah, blah, blah. We're taking quick action on these things. When, like I just said, like the last one, we're like, oh, we have to be very careful, and we're not going to shoot it down because it might hurt people, or we might be like seen as provoking a war or whatever. And like, we let it like float over our entire country for 3 days and did nothing about it. And now we're seeing people like almost take decisive action 2 in 1 day. And then like literally a week ago, they're saying, oh, this happens all the time. We just don't tell the public about it. So it is a PR thing, I think. And they just want to like overcompensate and say, oh yes, this we're tough on this stuff. But like I said, like if they're saying it's common, it's just very confusing for the public.
And that goes, Mateus, you sent me a political article that said the same thing, Mateus. Do you want to mention it to the audience?
Is
Mateus
Mateus
with
up
us,
here?
or he dropped
No,
out?
he's
He
not.
dropped out.
Yeah.
No, he just dropped out. I'll DM it, but I'll read out the article. He's just messaging me now, but I'll read out the articles from Political. Asked why there were seemingly more balloon downings and related incidents, a U.S. official said, quote, "We are being more vigilant now," which is in line with what Alex and Emergent said. I'm not sure if Austin, you said the same thing. That there isn't more sightings. The response is just more aggressive now, considering what happened with the Chinese balloon. So just wanted to mention that as well. But we'll go to Olsen Defender, who's been here for a while. How are you, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. Sorry, got a bit of a sore throat this evening. I did want to mention really fast that the Canadian military has apparently figured out what was shot down over their country, but they are refusing to announce what it is. So that I think that's rather interesting, and it definitely shows either that they don't want us to know, or they still don't know, and that they're just trying to make people think that they know what it is.
It's interesting. Yeah, if you can send me through any article or clips, I'll get Justin to play them. Captain, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of information to kind of sift through there in the last 45 minutes. Austin brought up some good points about the capabilities of the F-22 and what we choose to allow the bad guys to see when it happens. We can circle back. Alaska, Elmendorf Air Force Base has what we call a combat alert cell, and that's basically, we see it a lot in the news when Russia, as we like to say, probes the wire. Right, they send their Tu-95s over to our ADIS, tries to poke around, and then we send our F-22s up there to basically, tell them you're not wanted over here. Well, the thing about our F-22s, when we send them up over there, is we put our wing tanks on them, and what those wing tanks do is it completely eliminates the stealth characteristics of the aircraft. So if China was trying to somehow figure out how are they making these things stealth in these compounds that Austin was mentioning. I haven't seen any pictures of the aircraft that shot down whatever it was today, but I would bet that since they're coming out of that Alaska area, they would have those tanks installed, which would limit the ability for China to try to gather up any intelligence or any capabilities. So that's just something to really keep in mind. That's how they conduct those interceptions all the time. And I would be shocked if Russia didn't leak or share the information that they've gathered from our intercepts of what our response is. And we see when it happens, it's politicized on the news for about an hour, and then that's really the last that we hear of it. And now we have this going on, and it seems that it's getting a lot of traction very quickly.
Justin, you do have a clip from an eyewitness of the Montana UFO?
Brian Kilmeade has gone into his Super Bowl rants, but he broke real quickly just a few minutes into his program, played a taped segment with the pilot of a general aviation aircraft who spotted the balloon over Montana. Let me get this here.
To get us out of this mess. What I gleaned from the whole balloon calamity after calamity is the need for people to take the lead, citizens. After all, it was a average citizen in Montana who spotted the surveillance ship.
Oh, I think this is the first one. Sorry, but this is interesting. Just hear this out real quick.
Who called a journalist. Our president would not have acted without that proof.
As I was gathering my things, I just spotted this circle in the sky, and I knew it was something that was kind of out of place.
Chase told me where it was, so I had some long telephoto lens with me, and I got out of the car and started taking pictures of it. I put together all the pictures that I had taken and started sending them to the FAA and the governor's office, and they eventually put me in touch with NORAD.
Yeah. So again, that's an interesting take in that this really wasn't going to be a big issue altogether. And I've heard other clips on other shows talk about how this has been happening a lot, happens all the time. It got called out, and then it blew up into this national scene. And I think this guy is right. It's only going to be the sort of pressure that we put on as citizens to really press them on, how what is the import of all of these things flying over our heads on this piece, right? So let me find a few more clips, but that's just what I have right now. Again, the shows have all turned to Super Bowl coverage now, so that'll be the blanket spot for most of the networks for the next 24 hours until someone gets a good shot of a shoot down again. And there are videos that are purported to be the shoot down in Alaska, and maybe they say in Montana too. But again, so speculative. We'll just have to kind of keep playing around to see what we find there.
Yeah, I've been getting similar videos as well. Haven't tweeted them because it's just impossible to verify. So that I wish I could, but
There's
I'll get a lot of hate for that.
Going out to one person sent me a satellite falling and claiming it was the unknown object over Montana. So it's just a lot of fake videos going out right now. So
and you saw the same thing with the balloon. But by the way, how was the coverage, Rosalot? How was the coverage of the balloon that was shot down a week ago relative to the balloons that we're seeing now? How are you seeing both stories being covered by mainstream media?
I feel like it's the same, really, unless I haven't really watched the news that much, but I'm seeing a lot of the same reactions what we had last weekend. So, but yeah.
So I just kind of couldn't unmute. So I'll give you the mic, Nick, for a bit. Let me just bring up, we've got two special guests coming in. So let me organize with the team in the back end to bring them up.
Okay. Let me ask you this, Adam, if you're still around. Obviously, we do have some conflicting reports when it comes to whether there was an object in the sky. You've got NORAD saying one thing, you've got a U.S. congressman saying the other, another thing. And being that you did work in D.C. for a while, what kind of briefings do these congressmen get? Are these classified briefings? Is he even supposed to be talking about this?
So I can't imagine that he was receiving any sort of particularly classified information. And this is literally an example of a game of telephone, right? And I'm not saying that he's incorrect here, but the lag time between what he gets told and what is the current information on the ground may be different from what the press secretary actually is coming out. So we're basically in the same position as if neither side had made any public comments that we still don't really know. We won't know till tomorrow morning when there's going to be more clarification about the status of this unknown object in the sky. Most members most members won't get that kind of like detailed analysis that like the Defense Department appointees and bureaucrats would be getting right now.
Right. But being that he is still going on news networks, he's still on Twitter, he's still pushing this, does it even seem realistic that NORAD might be, maybe being disingenuous at the order of, say, the Department of Defense? Because as Alex said, this might be getting a little bit political. Does that seem, the realm of possibility?
I think so. Like, I think it's very interesting too. The governor of the state, Gianforte, came out and actually made a statement as well about some communications that he had with the White House regarding this situation. And his statement on Twitter, I had to pull it up and throw it up in the jumbotron. But he really. His statement was very political. He was very expressed a lot of frustration with the lack of information he was receiving from the White House about what was going on. And I think that's actually pretty par for the course right now. Is that there isn't a lot of information being going on right now, and the representatives and leadership of the state are kind of in the dark here. And NORAD hasn't been very clear about what was happening in the skies and whether or not there's still an object up there. However, given the fact that they did clear the space again, the airspace, it makes me want to ask: was there something? Is there still something possibly up there, or is there something not up there? I'm not really sure. I don't know what was done to cordon off the area at night when the first balloon was transiting the United States. My chief concern is, how does this potentially impact civilian air travel? Going back and forth over the state.
Right. So Emergent, I'm going to yield to you on that as well, and sort of a similar question there. Would NORAD open up airspace, or I'm sorry, the FAA open up airspace and revoke that National Defense Airspace designation, that TFR, if they actually thought something was in the air up there at potentially 40,000 feet? It's probably worth making a distinction here that 40,000 feet and 60,000 feet, it's a huge difference. The 60,000 feet, you don't see commercial air traffic at. So that's definitely worth noting. But what are your thoughts?
Sure, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there are altitude ceilings beyond which they either consider something to be a diminished or a non-threat. Because, for example, at some point something is in space, and we're not considering that U.S. airspace. But there are a few flight restricted zones that are actually defined as, if you will, 0 to infinity airspace. So there are a few. Normal airspace does have a ceiling, which they care, but there are a few things within NORAD protection that are considered infinite altitude. They consider anything over it would be in violation.
Interesting.
I want to go quickly to Mateus. Mateus, I've just got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind, man. When were Americans told about the first balloon?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question because we know that President Biden was briefed first on this situation on the 31st of January. I was actually with the president covering his trip to New York City about the infrastructure bill, but journalists did not notice anything kind of awry and unusual about his visit or any times he was maybe pulled aside or anything like that. We were made aware, obviously, after it was revealed on social media that there was something over Billings, Montana. So it's interesting to think about whether or not we would have been made aware of this had this not have broken on social media and gotten the traction that it did. What makes matters worse, possibly for the administration, is that on Friday, when John Kirby, who's recently taken the position as the White House coordinator for strategic communications, gave a briefing as part of the daily press briefing at the White House, he didn't reveal the information forthcoming that the second object was shot down over Alaska within the hour of him speaking. He had to wait for a reporter to kind of ask him, is something going on over Alaska? We're hearing unconfirmed reports of military activity. And then he pulled out this piece of paper and read off a statement. So again, kind of going towards the fact that we don't necessarily know if the administration would even reveal this kind of information if it weren't for the media and then with the earlier Chinese balloon, the public and their reporting on social media.
I'm just going through the audience questions. I've got another question here for you, Mateus. The way this was all communicated, because I know you keep covering breaking news on a regular basis. The way this was communicated, is it surprising? Or because I know I saw a few panelists earlier mention their concerns in the conflicting reports. But from, I just don't find that to be too surprising. I find it to be relatively common. They can't share everything instantly. And when there's breaking news happening, it's really difficult. Everything's dynamic. So it's really difficult to know what to share. Should we make something out of that lack of clarity that we're seeing, or is that relatively common?
No, that's why I'm being so careful what I'm doing, because it's obviously important to call out administrations over lack of transparency because we want the American public to know everything. But at the same time, you understand the importance of military secrecy to some extent, where when things like this occur, you almost want your own military to not share everything, because they're not just sharing with the American public, they're sharing with the world. So you don't play all your cards at once, but at the same time,
Yeah.
if John Kirby had a prepared statement to make, he should have led with that instead of waiting for a reporter to ask, because it doesn't look good for the administration, regardless of what his intentions were.
Austin, I want to go to you, man. We've covered, and you've been in our space on the Ukraine war. We've covered Chinese-U.S. Tensions in a space together as well. The escalation that we saw, again, is it fair, Austin, to speculate that this is Chinese, either spy balloons or spy flying objects, spying UFOs?
Yeah, I would say so. I wouldn't say when we look at other near peer adversaries of the United States that would have the capabilities to run a campaign like this, the only other one I would look at would be the Russians, and it's very clear that the Russians are currently tied up with the war in Ukraine right now. They legitimately really don't have the intelligence assets to spare beyond some of their strategic bombers, which, as Captain Osen and Emergent sort of pointed out earlier, they have a sort of a long-standing tradition of running some of their Tu-95 strategic bombers towards U.S. airspace and seeing what the response looks like that. And that's something that the United States has done as well with our B-52 platforms as well. It's kind of a long-standing deal there. And also previously, when we look at the Russians were party to the Open Skies Treaty that was signed in 1992 and existed until, I believe, 2020 or 2021, which essentially allowed Russian spy craft to overfly the continental and United States and our extended territories, as long as fair notice was given to NORAD in the case of the continental U.S. and Canada, and then other sort of U.S. combatant commands when it comes to areas like Guam, Puerto Rico, all of that fun stuff. Likewise, the United States was able to conduct spy intel gathering overflights of the entirety of the Russian Federation during that entire period. So what that means and why that matters is that the Russians, very much in regards to geospatial intelligence and everything like that, in regards to strategic nuclear capabilities, they already know everything that they would ever really want to know about the U.S. They know where silos are. They know which is important and why that treaty was signed, because the entire reason Open Skies was signed was to ensure that both the United States and Russia were abiding by some of the nuclear de-escalation treaties that were signed in the 90s. Anything from SALT to New START, basically reducing the overall nuclear arsenals of both the United States and, at the time, then the Russian Federation. So it makes very little sense to me, at least from what I've been looking at, for the Russians to all of a sudden start this sort of like balloon campaign, considering that the Russians already do have other ways of gathering intelligence. And to be quite frank, they know enough about the U.S. strategic nuclear arsenal that it really doesn't make sense for them to be expending a single dollar, or I guess a single ruble, on launching a new campaign for learning things that they would probably already know. That leaves China, and then I guess someone could make the argument that it's in the interest of Iran to do it, but Iran doesn't have the capabilities to do it. They don't have the aircraft. They don't have honestly, they don't have the wind on their side in regards to if they wanted to launch a balloon campaign. And so we end up back at China. And so as was verified with the first incident about a week and a half ago, it was the Chinese running that. I really don't see any other indicators pointing to another nation other than the PRC launching these.
And the argument is and you've always been pragmatic on stage, so I always like to have you here. The argument that China made, I want to again look at everything objectively, that the first balloon was a weather balloon, and we've all dismissed it, and rightly so. Do you agree with us dismissing that as a weather balloon?
I would agree with dismissing it, but I would also say that that's actually really indicative as to why they're choosing balloons themselves. I think balloons and the use of wind as opposed to a designated sort of propulsion device like a propeller or a jet engine, if you really wanted to fit one onto a balloon, which wouldn't really work out that well, it's plausible deniability at the end of the day, right? Because if you look at the initial sort of communications coming out of the PRC before they recognized that balloon, after they recognized that balloon as their own, They said it was wayward. They said it was a civilian research balloon. It was used for sort of weather analysis and everything like that. And when you're using no propulsion devices with something like a balloon, even though everyone here can recognize after just a quarter of analysis that if you launch a balloon from Inner Mongolia, it's likely going to end up in the continental U.S. because of how the jet stream operates. The use of a device that had zero propulsion lends towards the narrative that they were pushing, that this is off course. Like, we have no control over this. Why are you blaming us? We don't control the balloon. Nobody controls the balloon, right? So I think that's actually a very evidentiary sort of point to look at when we're seeing that the PRC has already done this, but also as a point when it comes to diplomacy, they can point at it as a balloon and say, like, well, we didn't tell it to go here.
So I've got another question for you. I'll go to Mateus first. Maybe he's got some breaking news. My next question is about the Chinese military, and are they at a position where they could provoke the US to this extent? Or is just the US stretched so thin that they're taking advantage of the situation? And is that linked to what's happening in Taiwan as well? But before answering those questions, Austin, Mateus.
Yeah, Austin made some great points about the fact that the Chinese most likely considered using a balloon for the reasoning that they can kind of deny that they have control over it. Although, to play devil's advocate, U.S. officials have confirmed that though there wasn't any propeller or driving factor with these balloons, they were able to use those jet streams and kind of play with them, and it was intelligent enough to be maneuverable via the wind while moving up and down, changing altitudes, things like that. So the balloon definitely had direction and was being directed, just not in a way that we're commonly used to, and also in a way that it's very easy to make it look like the balloon just has a mind of its own.
Justin, can you quickly play the clip that you have from CNN? Would love to hear their thoughts on this, or the narrative they have before going back to Austin.
Sure. This is a retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton, CNN host who you'll recognize, is coming in and asking him a question about this same sort of prodding. He has a interesting answer, I think, might bring us to some other discussions.
The possibility that we might have a foreign power like China or Russia sort of poking and prodding with these objects, how concerning is that from a national security standpoint?
So these are the kinds of things.
These are major no-nos, aren't they?
Well, we do that all the time.
Yeah.
We do it to them, they do it to us. But here's the no-no part. We don't overfly their territory. They have, in these cases, overflown our territory. If it is, in fact, the objects 2 and 3 are, in fact, from either China or Russia. We know that in the case of the first object, the balloon, obviously the Chinese did that. That was the big no-no. So the way things run in the reconnaissance world now is, yes, you test the systems, but you don't overfly the systems, the air defense systems of an adversary.
Don't get caught.
And you certainly don't get caught, not like Francis Gary Powers back in the early 1960s, who definitely got caught. But the rules have changed since then, so we don't do that kind of thing anymore. Now, when it comes to these kinds of assessments, yes, the Chinese and the Russians are obviously always testing our air defenses. It's very logical that they did this again. Let's see if the facts bear that.
Well, so there again, we hear that sort of testing, prodding, and also the rules have changed. I think a few speakers have alluded to perhaps the ROE have changed when it comes to this, because the big no-no, as Lieutenant Colonel points out, is the deal is we typically don't actually go over them, and these have.
Yeah, so this is, Austin, this is the point I want to touch on, is that we are living in that new normal. China's military seems in a position where, it has the audacity to fly over US airspace, or fly over US territory. So this is the particular point that I want you to touch on, because this is the point that concerns me, where China's either responding to US support for Taiwan or taking advantage of the US being stretched thin with Ukraine. Before you answer, I do want to tell the audience, we're not going to keep the space running too much longer. I think we've covered the news pretty well. So make sure you, I don't have the pinned newsletter, but if you're following us, you'll be notified when we do the space again. So make sure you do follow us. So when we do the space, we'll probably cover it tomorrow if the next balloon or next UFO is shot down tomorrow morning. And we'll get a few special guests. We'll prep in advance because this is breaking news space. We're in prep for it. We'll have panelists ready, and we'll probably dive deeper into U.S.-Chinese relations and what this all means. Because for me, that is the biggest point of concern on a personal level. Austin?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you reiterate what specific point you wanted me to talk on there?
With Chinese spying by flying over U.S. Territory, this is the big no-no, and this is the line that's been crossed. Am I looking too deep into it, or this is a line that kind of leads us into a new normal where China is just a lot more courageous?
So I wouldn't say you're looking too deep into it. I think what's important though is historical context here. And as you know, the clip from Justin sort of pointed out, I think another major incident in history to sort of look into for this would be the Francis Gary Powers incident. In which case, you know, at the time, the United States was conducting U-2 spy plane overflights of the Soviet Union quite often, and the reason that we were able to do that was because of the altitude specifically that U-2s flew at. It was untouchable by any sort of gun or missile that the Soviets had until they finally could. And when we look at instances like this, no matter what sort of the geopolitical playing field looks like between nations like the PRC and the United States, there are always going to be attempts to conduct overflights, to conduct intelligence gathering, right? That is the name of the game. That's how it's played. What we're looking at in this case in particular is very similar to the shoot down of Francis Gary Powers in the way that the moment one side switches its calculus, whether that's via technology, whether that's via diplomacy, whether that's via a change in the rules of engagement or the ROE, that is what sort of changes the playing field with how different things are conducted. And from what we've seen previously, is that it appears that some of these balloon-based overflights were conducted earlier, not this year, but in other years, and those did not result in shoot downs. What is very clear is that after sort of the amount of public attention that was paid to the larger Chinese balloon that overflew the U.S., is that the ROE and the way that the DoD and NORAD are dealing with these incidents in regards to not just physically and kinetically, but also in regards to how they're releasing this information to the public has shifted. And from my perspective, do I think that this is a sort of a resource sink for the United States? Do I think the Chinese have anything to gain over the Taiwan situation on this? I would say no. If you want to talk on the resource angle, the United States has had a consistently rising defense budget since 2016. And before that, you know, that budget only decreased slightly from the years preceding. I don't think we're going to see any sort of, and if you look at the types of equipment being used here, you know, the F-22 hasn't been, as OSINT Captain and Emergent pointed out, the F-22 has not been exported anywhere in the world. The United States is the only nation in the world that has that particular airframe. And so moving forward, I think what we're looking at is we're seeing, on a diplomatic standpoint, we're seeing Chinese displeasure being forced onto the shoot down of that first balloon off the coast of South Carolina. But I don't see that as having a large scale impact on any of the logistics surrounding U.S.-Taiwan and PRC-Taiwan relations. Because when we talk about something like that, we're not talking about balloons, which are generally fairly cheap to manufacture, right? We're talking about aircraft carriers. We're talking about, you know, total tonnage of a green water or a blue water fleet. And so I think what we're seeing right now is the Chinese have observed what the reaction was to that first balloon, and they're trying to drum up more attention over further balloons and try and make the current administration look incapable. I think we're looking at information ops in real time.
So let me ask you real quick, Emergent, if you don't mind, these new quote unidentified flying objects that are, you know, they might be coming from China, they might be coming somewhere else. It seems like with recent events, it's probably a lot of people are going to make the assumption they're coming from China. How long would they actually take to make that journey? Let's say they're balloons, okay, to float down the jet stream from China. What sort of time period are we looking at in order for them to get here? Would they have been launched before this balloon thing really started being a big deal?
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
I think I looked at the overview of it's been a few days since I looked at the article, the overview of the flight path of the original balloon, and I think it took 3 to 4 days from its estimated departure point, but that really depends on what the departure point is. I think it's a matter of a few days. It probably depends on the wind speed.
So based on that, it sounds like you're saying that these balloons would have been launched after the U.S. response to the previous balloon. You know, the
Yes, that would make sense.
Okay. And then what sort of capability does the United States have to be able to actually know where these launch points would be? Is that something that's realistic? Do we have the capability to even do that?
That's a lot of different. There's probably some Navy capability. Probably the ones who'd be most familiar with that would be NGIA, which is National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They have a lot of resources at tracking global assets like ship movements, supply and material movements. That's probably the primary source for the Ukraine, the Russian buildup on the Ukraine border. Things like departures of ships, shipping traffic, both civilian and military. So probably NGIA would be the primary source for that, but there are other possible sources.
Yeah, I do want to just ask you one last question. And before you answer that question, Emergent, I also want to get Cobbler report, the Kobesi letter, to give us final thoughts on the incidents that happened today. But just for the audience, we do these spaces whenever there's breaking news, as you probably all know. And there is a newsletter that we just started. It's pinned above. It's also retweeted on my account. You can subscribe there. Sorry, I just got woken up for the space, so I'm still a bit sleepy.
Sorry.
You can subscribe there to get a summary. All good, man. All good. I'm glad you woke me up. To get a summary of the spaces that we do. So make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. I do have one last question for you, Emergent. And by the way, my team's going to send you my number, Emergent. It'd be a pleasure to have you again as this situation develops over the next few days. And my question to you is for Chinese, and Austin was answering that question earlier, for Chinese flying objects, or for Chinese spying by flying over U.S. airspace. You seemed relatively at ease with that. Why? Because am I one of the few that find it to be an escalation? I was listening to. I was reading an article after the first balloon was shut down, and there, we know that China's spying on the U.S. The U.S. is spying on China, and the list goes on. Everyone's spying on everyone, but there are to-dos and not to-dos. And flying over the other country's airspace or territory is in the not to-do list. For that to change, is that a new normal? Is that an escalation?
So it's a new normal based. Sorry. I'm going to comment quickly here. I would say it's a new.
Yeah, go ahead, Austin. I'll go to Emergent. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
It's a new normal based upon technology, right? When in the era of when like spy overflights were conducted, specifically by the United States, they were either done by U-2 and later SR-71 platforms that were, flying higher or faster, depending upon which platform, than domestic air defense networks could respond to. After the advent of sort of wide-scale use of spy satellites, that hasn't really been necessary. We still have the U-2 platform, we still use it and everything like that, but the necessity for using piloted aircraft to conduct that sort of geospatial intelligence work has been largely supplanted by satellites. And so I would say that from what we're looking at right now with the balloons are different because I would posit that Chinese satellites have been orbiting, the United States for quite a while now, right? And so I think what we're looking at is not necessarily an escalation. It's more of a hark back to how espionage used to be conducted. And I think the public, that has been so far separated from the public since the glory days of the U-2 and the SR-71, that nations like Russia, nations like China don't have the need to run a piloted aircraft over the continental United States. They can just do that with a satellite. Unless
it has further capabilities. I know that Gorka would, Dr. Gorka wouldn't like me saying this, but we had someone on stage talk about, I think it was an ex-general that was talking about the testing balloons for carrying nuclear arms. I can't remember what it was. Another person was mentioning the balloons interfering with communication networks. So there could be, and by the way, both these, the first point that I mentioned, that's highly, highly unlikely for anyone listening to this. But the point I'm making is there could be other capabilities for the balloons that the satellites couldn't achieve.
So what I would say to that, and I think that's a very good point that you bring up, Mario, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed here, is the idea. So I've seen it talked about often too, is what if one of these balloons is carrying a weapon of mass destruction, whether that's biological, chemical, nuclear, or as some have posited, like an EMP device, right? I believe the United States government, and I would also say I would believe if the United States were to do this to the Chinese government or the Russian government, I think every government's response would be the same. They would treat it as the use of a WMD on home soil, and they would respond to it overwhelmingly. I think that is one of the fundamental constructing pillars of the doctrine of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And so I am extremely apprehensive towards the idea that the Chinese are using this. Yes.
So I meant, just to clarify, I meant not that they're not using it for this purpose today, but they kind of either testing it for that purpose or at least sending a signal like, hey, we could have
exactly. And so what I view as the negative on that argument, though, is that if they were, right, let's say that all of these balloons were undetected, the Chinese have, the go ahead that if they wanted to conduct a mass attack on the United States via balloon, they're able to do that. So this dives in a little deeper into the concept of the nuclear triad. The nuclear triad is the idea that just about every nuclear armed nation is able to deliver their weapons of mass destruction via three major pillars. The first being silos, so ICBMs, missiles. The second being aircraft, so via air bases from bombers. And the third being from submarines. That third pillar is the most important here, right? Because even if the Chinese really believe that they would be able to shut down the American power grid, drop a biological weapon from a balloon, which isn't really viable considering how biological weapons work, but let's say hypothetically it could, or, a large-scale nuclear attack conducted via, going under the radar, so to speak, even though that's not the case either. There's nothing in there that considers U.S. submarine positions at all. So I think the best way to put this argument to bed, and this is why I don't believe that this is the case, that the Chinese are trying to build up for a WMD attack later, is that, as we've already sort of gone over, these balloons, as of right now, as we've seen, are unguided. And if you're going to conduct a strategic attack using weapons of mass destruction, you need to hit certain areas. You need to hit silos. You need to hit radar networks. You need to hit, most importantly, submarines. And no balloon is ever going to find a U.S. nuclear submarine, just as any American balloon would never find a Russian nuclear submarine. And I think that's the best way to sort of talk about that.
Emergent, would you agree with Austin's response to this? Can you hear me, Emergent? The mic is not there.
There it is. There it is.
You're good.
Sorry,
yeah, all good, man.
lagged.
Yeah, all good, man. All good.
Yeah, I think I agree with his point of view. I think a lot of this is probably more probing. I mean, it's not unlike in some ways what a lot of what people don't know. A lot of what the Navy does. There's things like international agreements, like each country gets I think it's 15 miles of sovereign waters outside, but then there's international agreements about certain areas. But there's always been these cases where some country will just declare, oh yeah, well, the normal is 15 miles, but we declare 20 miles, right? The Gulf of Sidra incident in the 80s, where Gaddafi declared that, oh yeah, well, I get 200 miles of the Mediterranean as sovereign Libyan territory, and it was Reagan sent the carrier strike group there to shoot down his planes and prove to the world that, no, that's not your territory. So in a way, this is kind of, in a certain sense, it's kind of the Chinese doing the same thing, testing the limits, probing, seeing what they find out, seeing what the reaction is. Yeah, I think, and by the way, I linked 2 articles down there about the incident I talked about earlier, which I think is very historically interesting, and it's not very widely publicized. The 2004 incident was I misspoke earlier. I said congressman. It was actually the governor of Kentucky, Governor Fletcher, in 2004. He flew in to DC without filing a flight plan, and it was in complete violation of the post 9/11 rules, and they almost shot him down. So I posted it in the links. There's both an NBC and a WAPO article about it. Really, they even went so far as to evacuate the Capitol building because they thought it was another hijack scenario. So read that. Very interesting historical info, and kind of paints you a picture of what that is actually like.
Hey Mario,
Thanks
one
a
quick
lot.
question for
Yeah, go
your
ahead, Carl.
experts here is, what if this is just sort of a general trend? So several weeks ago, whenever they had their big meetings in China to sort of consolidate power, Hu Jintao was removed from those meetings in sort of a major spectacle that was a break from tradition, typically not something that China would do. And following that, when the World Cup started and people were following live coverage, and they suddenly saw not just people at the World Cup, but people around the world celebrating in mass, it started to dawn on the people that something about what was happening in their own country wasn't matching up to what the rest of the world was doing with respect to COVID. And so I just can't help but wonder if China may need some wins in some ways, because of the amount of duress that their leadership may be under now. And I long speculated that China couldn't keep a zero COVID policy and go to war in Taiwan and other NATO nations. And so I just wonder if there's a sort of pivot out of a little bit of anxiety over. You could argue that in the worst possible world, China handled COVID so poorly. And if people in America and other Western nations are upset about how we've been treated during these times, imagine what a population like that must be feeling after they've been locked down for years, used inadequate vaccines, and then
I think Kasabi, I would love you to answer that question. Kasabi, Kobayashi, I'd love you to answer that question and answer the question that I had. I think my question and Carl's question kind of go in line. Why is China doing this? So I'd love you to answer that question, and I'll go to Piotr as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, the first thing I'll say is I just pinned this timeline that we just tweeted a few minutes ago. Why? I mean, it took us 3 days to shoot down the first balloon. Now we're shooting down these UFOs almost by the hour, and this whole thing over Montana in the morning that we're going to engage with. China is testing the waters here, but I also think the U.S. is also testing the waters. They're trying to see when they shoot down a Chinese-owned balloon or some sort of Chinese-based espionage, what's the Chinese reaction to this, right? And we're coming off, the Kobayashi letter, we're a financial publication, so we're kind of looking more into what does this mean more on the economic side? I mean, we're coming off a historic trade war from the Trump era between the U.S. and China. We're finally starting to see supply chains normalize, but then we also know that China has their eyes on Taiwan, which is the biggest producer of semiconductors in the world. So is this China trying to poke at the U.S. and see, all right, well, this is their reaction if we fly over the U.S. What happens if we keep flying over Taiwanese waters, or we sail around Taiwan? What is this going to do? Is the U.S. going to impose further tariffs like we saw over the last few years? So I think China is really just trying to see what happens. I mean, we're going to keep testing the waters here, and we know that China has their eyes on Taiwan. I mean, we know that they're expected to invade by 2027, and we also know that tech companies have been under pressure, and China knows. So I think they see now is the time when we're a little bit more vulnerable, and this is in the news, and it's become very political. So I really think they're just going to keep testing the waters here. And now that all Americans are watching this in the media, it's become extremely it's become kind of this media battle of which side is stronger. So we could see this keep escalating, and until one side puts a clear end to it, it's going to get a little bit more dirty, we think.
Mario, a quick follow-up for him would be after your guest several days ago, the general that said he could see it wouldn't be far-fetched for him to see a scenario where things escalate to the point that China makes a move on Taiwan before the next election. And so what I guess I'm trying to ponder here is the meta-narrative about China is that they think dynastically, whereas we think quarterly and every 2 years for our, midterm elections and then our major elections every 4 years. But they think 100 years out, 500 years out. Well, what if they handled things so poorly that in order to maintain the sort of narrative dominance, they've just had to update their prognostications about 2027. Okay, well, what if that timeline has been expedited now because they have to do something to reassert themselves in the world?
Yeah, that's. I mean, especially as this whole 2027 deadline has been in the
So,
media
Kyle,
for
there's a couple of things I
the
want to
last
jump.
few weeks.
Is it me or is Piotr messing up?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, your connection, Piotr.
Can
Can
you
you hear me?
Yeah, I can
Your
hear you.
connection's
Can
really
you hear me?
bad, man.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, you're back now. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, Carl, I think you're very astute. What is the biggest fear that autocrats have? It's for their population to become more enlightened, for them to become more informed about the opportunities and freedoms and liberties that other countries, other populations, other civilizations have. Right. Look at the Soviet Union. What did they try ever so hard to do? To limit the amount of infiltration of Western media, pop culture, and so on during the late 20th century. So when the zero COVID policy happened and the white paper protests, as they became unofficially to be known, happened, that was the biggest threat that President Xi has faced during his premiership since he took office. And this is significant because it's the first time we've seen this form of China. There's much more assertive wolf warrior diplomacy, which is just a fancy way of saying they're more assertive in their foreign policy, going about, having to deal with demographic and domestic issues. So they have two main things now. They have domestic crisis, both from a housing issue, housing bubble, and a public health crisis. And then that is playing into their foreign policy aspirations and interests. So when you have Taiwan on the radar, which is, I still remain on the fence as to whether or not they ever actually intend to invade, and I'll give you a couple of reasons why in a minute. This is something that you could potentially see pushing up their agenda as to why they need to do it sooner rather than later. President Xi isn't getting younger, and he wants to be the man to restore China to its glory days, as you mentioned, the dynastic period. So I don't know whether or not what's happening now, i.e. with these balloons, with these aerial objects, has any direct significance to Taiwan, because this is the US mainland, and this doesn't necessarily play into the US strategical narrative when it comes to Taiwan. But I do think that this is definitely an interesting development. As I said before, the Canadians and the Americans have a partnership with each other regarding airspace defense. So this engagement between Trudeau and Biden was not that surprising. And I don't think that this aerial object is of immediate national security, because otherwise the US Air Force and others wouldn't be allowing it to bob about over US airspace over the night. So to your point about Taiwan, very last point, I think is that it's not going to happen yet. When I spoke to, we had Brigadier General Robert Spalding here, and I've spoken to various other American defense officials in the past on my podcast, and there's varying degrees of interest over how much this could happen. It's definitely something that is on the radar, but the reason why I remain skeptical is because China, in times of strife, specifically the party, need a object. They need something to stimulate nationalistic sentiment, and Taiwan is the perfect example of that. And I think that you could see this remaining always a bit on the precipice, on the possibility of invading Taiwan, but never actually being done so. The Chinese have definitely got more emboldened in the past 10 years, but we've also seen even in the past 6 months, President Xi's foreign policy narrative changed a little bit. When he spoke to the Saudis, when he spoke to the Iranians, he was a little bit more. When he went to the G20 meeting, and even at the World Economic Forum, a representative of China was there to try and emphasize that China is more collaborative now. I don't believe that for a second, but I think it illustrates that China is trying to be a little bit more nuanced with its way of conducting foreign policy, and these balloons and other stuff may well be just another part of that psychological warfare. I'll land that.
Adam, anything to add? And I know that the Kubasi letter was also speaking. Anything to add, guys, on what Piotr mentioned? And I want to go to a final question. Intel Schizo, who's been on the stage before, did send me a great explanation of why he thinks China is using balloons, which could look like outdated technology for many of us. So I'll give Intel Schizo the mic right after Adam and Kubasi letter respond as well, if they've got anything to add. Adam.
Yeah, anything I would add would be taking us way too off course. So I'll let Intel Schizo or Kubasi go ahead.
I appreciate it, Adam. And by the way, I've just sent you through my number. Would love to have you on a future space on this story. Kubasi letter, anything to add? Because I know you were speaking earlier when Piotr glitched out.
Yeah, I mean, nothing really to add. I think a lot of what we've said has kind of been echoed in here. But I mean, obviously the whole Taiwan, we were talking about the whole 2027 Taiwan invasion timeline. I mean, it's up in the air, but also, China doesn't want, they know that it's critical that they move quick on this kind of thing if they're going to do it. And they don't want this to be something in the media for 3 years, 4 years before it happens. So whether this is a sign of them testing the waters to see what the U.S. would do if tensions were to escalate or not, and now, even if this wasn't intended to be something as a major topic, now that it's all over the media, they might look to capitalize on it. So that timeline definitely is dynamic.
And Intel Schizo, I'll give you the mic just to kind of give us tell the audience the message that you sent me about why you think China could be using balloons when they've got satellites.
Yeah, so China's been seeing near space, that's the term that they dub it, as a new front for military powers across the world to start competing in. They've looked at the United States. There's tons of articles out there in Chinese academic papers. There's like over 1,000 on just near space designs of various equipment. They see this as the next frontier for military technology, and they don't want to be left behind, and they don't want to be behind the ball compared to other countries. And they've really focused in on this. They see that this section of space has advantages over satellites, whether it's the geospatial imagery side, you can get better resolution photos, whether it's the SIGINT side where you can do collections a little better.
And I Skids, I just want to share something very briefly. Just got breaking news from Breaking 4 News. Mateus, who's on stage, just want to mention it briefly. We'll cover it tomorrow, but Iranian president will visit China from Tuesday to Thursday at the invitation of President Xi Jinping. That was quoted by China's foreign ministry, and that was just in the past half an hour. I think it was the piece of news came out 10 minutes ago, so I'm guessing this is very recent. Came on the Jerusalem Post. Mateus, when was that announced? Do you know? When did China announce this?
It seems to be, it seems to be that it was announced fairly recently. I forwarded you the report that I saw from the Jerusalem Post, but it was also reported by Global Times, the Chinese state-affiliated media that went out at 11:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So it's been going out within the past 10-15 minutes. Yeah.
I appreciate it, man. And Justin, I know you've got a really interesting clip that you wanted to play as well that Tom Fitton tweeted.
Yeah, our own Tom Fitton just uploaded this to his account. This was a presser I think he had, and it's all about what our topic du jour.
Believe me, Judicial Watch is going to investigate the heck out of this. We had FOIAs that went out immediately in response to this attack. We're going to find out what went on, what's gone on previously, and what other risks we're facing as a result of this haplessness from this, not only the Biden administration, but our defense establishment. This is a sad day for America. It's concerning. It's disturbing in the sense that we are kind of like this hapless giant, unable to do anything in the face of this rather obvious provocation, this brazen attack on our sovereignty, and the failure and the exposure of our weakness in the face of this. And the weakness, it's not in my view, a technological or military weakness. It's political weakness. This is the decision by our military leadership with the approval, presumably, of President Biden, who's commander-in-chief, not to do anything to protect our homeland from this ongoing attack.
So I think obviously Tom up in arms and the FOIA king that he is, that'll be interesting to see what it comes back.
Yeah, Tom's a regular on the space, so I've just DM'd him. We'll bring him on tomorrow to get his thoughts on this. Nick, I think we should cover this tomorrow when the next balloon or next UFO, if it gets shot down over Montana, will be a good space to kick off with a focus on U.S.-China relations. What do you think, Nick?
Absolutely. I think this is going to continue developing here, especially because it does seem like the U.S. government has said that they're going to resume this operation that they were working on tonight when daylight breaks in Montana.
Yeah, and as always, we'll keep things objective, try to give you the facts, and always have balanced opinions on the panel. But I think it was great. I was just giving one a massive shout out to Raw's Alerts and Breaking 4 News for playing a key role in getting this space started and giving us all the information we need, and all the panelists that we had that came out on and off, and of course Nick for helping co-host the space, and our regular panelists. We have Austin, Piotr, who are regulars on the space. Justin for playing the clips. He's the clip guy. Justin, you're the best for playing clips and giving commentary on those clips. I love it, man. So if you could do it in every space. Yeah, the way he does it, the audio's impeccable. His commentary, it's on point, never glitching. So yeah, Justin, I'm probably going to give you a call after this.
I kept the comedy to a minimum. I was going to bring up, the "Welcome to Earth" clip from Will Smith, but we'll play that for another time.
yeah. You DM me, Justin. DM me, say, Mario, I've got this clip. I'm like, no, man, not this space, not today. I also want to give a shout out, All Source News and other panelists that are regulars on the space. But otherwise, yeah, I think it was a great space. Really enjoyed it. For the audience, hope you enjoyed it as well. The newsletter's pinned above. It's retweeted on my account. If you want a summary of the space, otherwise, to see us whenever there's breaking news, we'll be covering it. Okay, love you all. Thank you so much. Ian, Nick, anything to add?